Welcome everyone to our symposium from the ruins of preservation, rethinking heritage through counter archives. Thank you all very much for coming bright and early. We're very excited to be here in the German Historical Institute of London. My name's Rodney Harrison. I'm Professor of Heritage Studies at University College London and Arts and Humanities Research Council Heritage Priority Area Leadership Fellow. And the AHRC Heritage Priority Area is a co-sponsor and co-organiser with the German Historical Institute of London, and we thank both of these institutions for providing funds to allow us to make this wonderful event happen. So my co-organiser is Mirjam Brusius. Mirjam will put her hand up here. She knows the logistics of the German Historical Institute better than I do, so if you have any questions, specific questions throughout the day, perhaps best to address them first to Mirjam. And but come and find me also if you need anything that we might be able to help you with. Some housekeeping things before we make a start. Toilets are downstairs. There's information about the Wi-Fi in the packs that you should have been handed when you came in at registration. There's also fire safety information in your packs, so please do read that. And do wear your badges at all times in the building so that we can identify who you are. And please don't bring cups or food or drinks into this room. So we have coffee and tea in the room next door, and we'll be having lunch also in the room next door. Is that correct? Lunch next door, yeah. So do just leave food and cups in that room. We need to say hello to those who are joining us on the live stream. We have Teresa and Abdul who are helping with the filming. And live streaming over both days. For those that are joining us for the live streaming, we won't be live streaming all of the presentations for various reasons, mostly copyright related. Some of the speakers won't be being live streamed, so if you get a blank screen, go away and make yourself a cup of tea and then come back later, because it won't be the end, and it's not necessarily a technical issue, it's just because that individual paper is not going to be streamed. And those papers that are live streamed will then subsequently be available, edited and available on our website for those that aren't able to be with us today. Any other housekeeping-y things before we start? No. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, welcome everyone, and thank you very much to our three fabulous keynote speakers who will be checking in with at various points throughout the packed and super interesting two-day program. We, when Mirjam and I started thinking about this conference, it really emerged as part of a conversation with two of the keynote speakers, and with the third keynote speaker in the back of my mind, who just presented at the launch event for the AHRC Heritage Priority Area. And we wanted to do something which began to open up debates within heritage studies and bring heritage studies and histories of heritage back into conversation with one another. And we were aware that there was a kind of frustration on both sides. On the one sense, historians might be very frustrated with the ways in which heritage studies has tended to address itself specifically to what's going on in the present, perhaps turning a blind eye to the kind of histories of the emergence of heritage dialogues and discourses, and the kind of conventional sources that historians are interested in looking at, whilst on the other hand, contemporary heritage scholars are perhaps frustrated with historians for what might be argued to be a fairly limited focus on very conventional archives. So we sort of had this idea of doing something around the counter archives and heritage. We didn't really want to define that term counter archive very strictly, and we want to keep it quite open, and we hope that the speakers will help us to begin to define what that means in relation to heritage studies more strictly. But we had in mind a whole range of different things: landscapes, material culture, archaeological sites, oral accounts, people, photographs, things that are often left out of conventional historical analyses in one way or another. So this sort of very long conference call that we put out, sort of developed out of this set of conversations and set of interests. And we received a kind of overwhelming response. I can't quite remember the numbers, 120 odd sort of expressions of interest in presenting, which we cut down to the 20 or so papers that we'll be seeing over the course of the next couple of days. So that really encouraged us to think that this is a sort of important topical area, and we're excited to see how people respond to the call for papers that were given. So we will begin with our first keynote presentation from Karen Salt. Karen is based at the University of Nottingham. She directs the Centre for Research in Race and Rights and leads the university's Black Studies PhD program, which is the first of its kind in Europe. She's written on issues of sovereignty, power, and systems of governance. She's a member of the Arts and Humanities Research Council's Advisory Board and Deputy Chair of the UKRI's External Advisory Group for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. And her monograph, The Unfinished Revolution, Haiti, Black Sovereignty and Power in the 19th Century Atlantic World, is available from Liverpool University Press. She's working on a number of new projects, and today she's going to be presenting a paper to us called Excavating Resistance, Exploring the Ruins of History and the Marks of Injustice in the Archives. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Karen.
Well, it's really great to be here, and I was extremely excited to get the invitation. I know for some within the sort of critical heritage, cultural heritage community, it does seem as if Rodney and I are a bit joined at the hip. But part of it, I think, is that there's so much really interesting, vital, kind of critical conversations happening within critical heritage that it seems like a very natural place for me to play and share evolving work with you. So first, I'll have to start with an apology. I am battling a pretty vicious food poisoning episode, so I think that we're just mostly excited that I'm actually standing and in front of you. So yeah, you will get probably me at about 60%, I would gather, as opposed to 100. But this also means that I will likely not subject you to me for over the 2 days. So I'm hoping I can make it to about lunch today. But I wanted to forewarn you, if you want to come and chat to me a lot and I look like I'm flagging, it's not you. It really is me, as opposed to about you. So what I'm going to present to you today is actually an evolving series of kind of reflections that I've been ruminating in relationship to a bit of work. And this is actually a culmination of other sets of work. So it's not that this is the only one, but there's been a particular project that has really nudged me to start thinking quite differently about either archives or history or memory, and specifically protest and resistance in really intriguing ways. And because of the nature of this project, which I'll take you through, so I have a number of slides, issues like structural racism and dislocation and displacement and injustice have featured quite heavily, as have thinking about what are the sort of entanglements within land and within space and within moments of protest and resistance, especially the sort of structural embedded sets of inequalities that are everywhere, right? They're in oral stories, they're in portraits, they're in pictures, they're in how stuff has been captured or collected, as well as in the memories of folks. So it's interesting that Rodney started thinking about these tension points between particular sets of fields, because this was a particular project that has really kind of laid bare the fact that all of this is actually an archive. and what happens when we read and look across all of it. So the lived experiences of sets of people, particular sets of people, the official record, what the official record says that might be captured by the state or captured by some sort of municipality, the resistance efforts that communities have been engaged in to try to re-narrate their story, and ultimately, what does that mean in terms of their sort of future within particular environments? So I've been really thinking about this as an excavation project to a certain extent, and what does it mean to try to excavate these moments of injustice in ways that recognize the sort of power hierarchies and embedded tensions. There's a little bit at the bottom of this title about exploring the ruins of history and the marks of injustice in the archives. And I do think of this now as marks. Sort of where are the sort of presences of some of these sets of things that I'm discussing and thinking about, because in some cases they're not necessarily all written out in a nice neat order with bullet points and just sort of say I'm the injustice file, and you pull it out and you just sort of read through that, but instead you get these sort of eruptions and utterances and tension points. Even amongst communities that are mobilizing and coming together to essentially try to create their own understandings of their own protest histories. So I should say that I direct the Center for Research in Race and Rights, and we do an incredible amount of engagement work, consultation, interactions with various stakeholders and groups, but we do a lot of research projects. And one of the interests of the center to write projects at scale, primarily to give jobs to people, but to actually rigorously think about the methods that you need to do certain sets of critical work, and probably. I would say over the past probably about 4 years, I've become increasingly frustrated with fairly limited methodologies across a range of fields, whether or not it's critical race studies, all the way through to what might be constituted as international relations or history. I think in some ways the types of issues, at least for me, that I'm grappling with and working through, most of these methods, let's just put to the side whether or not we think these methods come from a particular knowledge base or they are not responsive to certain sets of people. I also think that they can't do the job. And ultimately the job we need is a really creative space that can ultimately help us understand as essentially what this subtitle is sort of provoking, the sort of marks of injustice. I don't know if a regular history type of method would do that. I don't know if ultimately going out and walking the landscape will essentially do that side of work. So there's a challenge that I've been issuing to myself and to the teams I've been creating, quite interdisciplinary, to think about how do you understand structural inequality? How do you understand notions of displacement and dislocation? How do you understand the ruptures of power that are embedded in people's lives, that live in the sort of realities of their existence? What methods do you ultimately take to that? And how do we really challenge ourselves to think about how do we build these sorts of kind of research programs? It's the same for those of you who might do exhibitions or who might work in museum world. It's the same sort of critical question. If we are taking older forms of logics and constructions to these problems that we know are quite embedded and historical and laced across spaces, we should be dissatisfied with the results because it's going to give us almost the same thing that we've been doing before that. So we need to think differently. So what I'm going to present to you is a bit of the effort to do some of that. I'm pushing buttons. Good. On here, nothing happens. So it's looking the same. So, but at least you see this. So the project that I'm going to talk to you about is actually not a technical research project. Can you kind of see it? Just about. It is a network, and so any of you who've written grants will know essentially how to play the game. So the Arts and Humanities Research Council is essentially the only entity in all of the UK that recognize the UN International Decade for People of African Descent. Not Prime Minister, not Parliament, no one. And up until this point, it's essentially the only body. And AHRC isn't technically a governmental body. It's a non-government organization that many of you may be funded by. So AHRC put a highlight notice out that they were essentially interested in, as they say, any kind of research that, that addresses the decade. And it's really quite fascinating, the aspects of this decade. And through a series of sort of beautiful instances, because the highlight notice stretched for a period of time, there were somewhere around 11 or 12 networks that emerged, covering a range of issues and things, and not necessarily all directly focused on a singular topic. And the decade itself actually gives, thank you, everyone. The decade itself actually gives a wide area to work on. It goes, as this last slide gives you a sense of, oh, I don't know if it gets the date, 2024. So the decade lasts for quite a long time. There's quite a lot of activity that's embedded within it. And essentially, these are the three pillars. So the three pillars end up being recognition, issues around justice and development. And this smaller print here says, in proclaiming this decade, the international community is recognizing that people of African descent represent a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted and protected. Around 200 million people identifying themselves as being of African descent live in the Americas. Many millions more live in other parts of the world outside of the African continent. Now, there's a bit of a dilemma in the UN about, is this an issue about outside of Africa? Is this an issue about inside of Africa? But that hasn't stopped people from essentially, in terms of putting bids into the AHRC, to produce projects where people are working around Ethiopia, they're working in various other places, because they're thinking about this much broader. But a lot of these sorts of issues, whether or not it's the recognition part, the justice or development, are thinking about reparative work, not necessarily monetary reparations, but different forms of repair, whether or not that might be cultural retethering, issues around reconciliation, issues around injustices, and definitely, you know, sustainability and transformation within particular places. So this motivated me and a set of my colleagues to essentially put in a bid. And at that particular point, we'd been doing quite a lot of work with Black Lives Matter UK, and interacting with a number of different sort of activists communities. There had been a whole range of issues, from why is my curriculum white to roads must fall in various locations. And so these are the things that kind of motivated us to think really quite critically about, well, what are these protest histories and cultures? What are they, and how are they embedded around certain critical questions around justice and around human rights, and what are people drawing from? And you know, this is an audience, I think, to sort of pose the question, which is, what is that archive look like amongst the African diaspora, and where is it located? And for us as a project, I mean, this is AHRC, this is the logo of a community interest corporation, we call them here, like a social enterprise. And it's Bright Ideas Nottingham. It's been around in Nottingham for about 25 years or so. They're an ongoing partner. We've been working on various projects together. And what we wanted to do was to take activists and scholars and activist scholars, along with various community groups, and bring them together to essentially start thinking about, through case studies and different sets of network building, what does this sort of protest memory and protest heritage look like? Those are some of the folks. Lisa Robinson is the sort of collaborator she's the director of Bright Ideas. We had a PhD student, one of our Black Studies PhD students, who was involved with the project as a project assistant for a while, and that was great to be able to build things. And then we have this really big list of what we call participating communities in the network. So these would be activist communities in Nottingham, Black Lives Matter UK, various cultural and heritage archaeologists in St. Lucia and St. Vincent, because we're really interested in the Garifuna. Former residents and activists connected to Africville in Nova Scotia, which is one of the projects I'll talk a little bit about. We did a program around called Shapeshifters, which is around youth leadership in Nottingham. It was a kind of 6 to 8 week program. And then we were interested in other sort of protest cultures within the diaspora, because ultimately for us as a group, we were really interested in what are the strategies of survival that have come about. Where do those sit? We were less interested in sort of big events and days and episodes and moments and laws. Those are interesting. But we really wanted to how do you understand the everyday struggle of some of these communities? Where does that information sit? Is it embedded in particular people's memory and their knowledge? So you need to sit down and talk to folks. Is it in the archive that has been gathered by some of these sort of critical museums and spaces that are connected to these communities? Is it in the sort of political work that they've been doing? Is it in the legal language that they've been involved in? And that maintained itself as a sort of really critical question, which are where would anybody go to find out what others have been doing in the diaspora? And I can just say right now, we don't know. There is no sort of place that sort of talks about strategies, much less for this sort of question, but for other cultures and communities. We tend to privilege a lot of objects and things and material, and not seeing strategy as material. Or there have been these sort of celebratory sort of spaces and places where there's sets of information and sort of heritage and culture, whereas the survival is a heritage to a certain extent for some of these communities. To be able to persistently exist and resist dislocation is something that they have passed on. They're passing on that knowledge of what that essentially looks like to various sets of individuals. And once we started making our lens a bit bigger, it was interesting to think how local that knowledge might be, or how isolated it might be in a particular community. Right, these are the big list of aims. I said some of this about possible futures, global intersectionalities, responding to other forms of protest. Does it draw from other tactics, anti-lynching, decolonization, anti-apartheid? We really wanted to try to understand this in a much longer arc, as opposed to the sort of proliferation that normally starts to circulate around some protest situations right now, to say that they're very presentist. Students have mobilized to demand this and do that, and then people forget about the anti-apartheid movements. Or they think about the students mobilizing and doing various things right now, and they might forget completely about Black Power movements that are global, right? The Black Panther parties in parts of India, for example. So this has sort of erased itself from certain people's memories. Much less the sort of decolonization movements now, even in the museum world, it needs to look back at the West African student unions in the 1940s, let's say in the UK, and how vital they were across multiple spaces to bring West African traditions and cultures alive, and also to think critically about independence. But these stories don't talk to each other. They tend to sort of sit in isolation. And we were really interested in thinking about that hyperlocal and think about what happens if we start to network folks together. So I'll just flash upon two things about the sort of legacies and the creations on this list. And these are quite fundamental to how we've started to try to problematize these projects. A compilation of living libraries, and oral histories from across the diaspora. This became really key to us to recognize that in a lot of cases, we needed to create these sorts of spaces that were alive, that can be routinely updated. I'll give you an example. There's a Mr. Jimmy, as I consistently call him, is an elder from St. Lucia who's been gathering for probably the past, he's not 100% sure, but people think it's been the past 50 years, artifacts on the island that are connected in some ways to Atlantic racial slavery. And so he's been just gathering them. And as he's been gathering them, people know now that you go to Mr. Jimmy if you see something or if you find something. And what he's been doing as he's been picking these pieces up, he's been repurposing a number of them into buildings and things that he owns and restaurants and spaces. So these are like massive bells that would have called enslaved persons from the field to food or other sets of things. And then he's also been gathering stuff that has been just left, anchors from ships or logs or information. So he's gathered all of this and he's proliferated it across his land, or in these businesses that are really near his land. And for those who come, you can sit with him and he'll tell you some of this. You could also just come and eat in some of these places and not know that this stuff is there. There's no plaque, there's no sign, there's nothing there that communicates to this. But it is in the knowledge of the people on the island that this stuff exists, and it's in Mr. Jimmy's head. So we did a tour with him to help us work through various parts, and really thought, this is a library, a way of working and capturing and collecting information. What would happen if we turned that into a series of sort of pop-ups and interactions that people who are not on island could actually access, but also essentially make this available to people who are trying to understand this sort of lived experience and the legacies of enslavement who come to the island itself. So these are the things that we're trying to explore to think about what possibilities might exist. But we were really interested here in creating and fostering partnerships between museums, trusts, community groups, and activists and scholars to think what would ethical partnering look like, and different types of research engagements and sort of critical praxis look like on an ongoing basis that's not dependent necessarily on funding, that recognizes people's worth, that's not trying to get stuff for free, but ultimately is trying to build this sort of partnership and sets of interactions, because we were really interested in ways of working as well. Oh, that's impossible to see. Right, I'll read this one to you. I'll pull it up on mine. This is a piece that I'm going to come back to because almost as soon as we started doing this work and interacting in particular sets of spaces, we started encountering, my apologies to the folks who want me to get closer to the mic. So this is from Avery Gordon, and I'll just read it to you. This is from a piece from Avery Gordon where she was saying, I was trying to develop, and this is about her talking about ghostly matter. I was trying to develop a working vocabulary that registered and evoked the lived and living meeting in their historical time of the organized forces of order and the aggrieved person when consciousness of that meeting was arising, haunting, forcing a confrontation, forking the past and the future. I thought at that meeting point, in the gracious but careful reckoning with the ghost, we could locate some elements of a practice for moving towards eliminating the conditions that produced the haunting in the first place. Now, I've turned to thinking about this idea of hauntings for a couple of different reasons. One is, I think that might be outside. One is that I've been more and more convinced that around issues around race and ethnicity, many cultures around the globe are haunted. I think they're haunted by inabilities to talk about particular sets of things. I think they're haunted by past instances and interactions. I think this proliferates in the material that's collected as well as what's shown, as well as in how people talk about various things, if they talk at all. So thinking about these sorts of racial relations or ethnic relations as hauntings gives me the opportunity to really start to kind of problematize and think about what does it mean to try to unveil something, or what does it mean to try to display something, or what does it mean to try to critically reckon with something or to create something. Because we just assume that there's empty vessels and we just put information in there and enlightenment will come and everybody will suddenly go, wow, I didn't know that, I feel so much, I'm aware, and it doesn't really work that way. The entrenchment of various forms of difference, the entrenchment of various forms of rejection of that knowledge, whether or not we want to imagine that as sort of agnotology or not, we've got these sort of fairly persistent interactions that happen. That means, let's say in an instance in the UK, if somebody says something horrifically offensive and racist, they can say sorry, and then they can say I'm not a racist, and then people are going to move on. Because that's the level of sort of racial literacy that we ultimately have in terms of talking about things. Yet there are other sets of people who walk into various spaces. I'll just use myself as an example. I've said this many times. A number of the different things that I'm involved in take me to Parliament or Whitehall or various other locations. And the most consistent people who look like me in the building are the catering staff, almost consistently. If I'm in a higher education institution, the largest percentage of people who look like me are the cleaners, or sometimes security. So these are the things that haunt me as a person trying to move amongst this landscape in these spaces. and to try to talk to particular people who might be senior management about things, you see what happens when the haunting is made visible, right? When it's treated as matter. And that is essentially what Gordon's really sort of pushing other scholars to, mostly sociologists, but others to reckon with, which is what happens when you attend to the materiality of this haunting, and you treat it as an actual thing. So, okay, I've really been listening to this, and I've been really thinking about this in relationship to my work, but I really started thinking about, well, how does this work around moments of resistance and moments of protest? And I'll give you a couple different scenarios. So, while you can't see a slide now, and they'll try to figure out, she just closed it, so it might still be living somewhere. I'll just give you a bit of sort of why this has been rearing its head and with this project. And I've been speaking about this a little bit, about protest ghosts. It became really quite clear when we were working in St. Lucia. Because as we initially started our work in St. Lucia, we were going to various activist communities or communities that were working around a number of things, primarily issues around protecting heritage or endangered landscape. And as we started talking to various members, they would almost routinely say, Lucians don't protest. I mean, it was literally like in 2 seconds out of their mouths would be, people in St. Lucia just don't protest. That's just not what we do. We don't have a history of protesting at all. And then we would have conversations about different things, and we would move our way through conversations. And then I went to the archive, the actual official archive for St. Lucia, which is not far from Derek Walcott's house, who's a Nobel laureate. And when I spent time with the actual newspapers of St. Lucia, the two major newspapers, moving my way through these newspapers became fascinating. I started with things like the West Indian Federation, and was tracing out this sort of moment of potential self-determination and independence, and seeing how people in St. Lucia were responding and interacting with that. So I knew that exist. And very quickly, I encountered material as I was going decade by decade, this kind of really boring, kind of long-term archive, kind of looking through big giant packs. Hit stuff from the 90s. And in the 90s, there were a series of very extremely large, island-specific protests from the banana plantation workers. And they were vocal. They were occupying roads, they were doing massive barricades, and they were protesting various forms of interaction that were set up by the state to try to push them out, bringing in sort of outside entities. And these were huge. And included most of the community that were involved in banana growing. But more specifically, they became quite quickly quite violent. And in the case of St. Lucia, these were violence perpetrated amongst the protesters by the police. So they were a number of killings and then a number of reckonings. But it didn't end there. Because the community was so motivated by the work that the banana plantation workers were involved in, it actually spurred other workers and other unions and other groups to engage in their own form of strikes, bus drivers, other forms of workers who were engaged in protest. And it was really quite fascinating to essentially be witnessing this protest history in the archive, but actually starting to talk to individuals who were emphatic that that history didn't exist. I mean, emphatic. And slowly, as we started sort of trying to probe what was going on with this, it became really interesting that some people would almost, they'd have to pull at the memory to try to actually remember that something had happened in the 1990s, that there were these killings. And we became really interested in what was it about the moment of those protests that actually created so much trauma within particular sets of communities that the only way that they were to survive is to actually engage in amnesia, right? The amnesia became the inoculation because if you were to engage in this protest, you could potentially die. right? If you were to let your children or your sons or your daughters or your friends go off and protest, they could also be dead. And that became fascinating for us to think about what is it about the ghostly presence of certain forms of resistance that actually might work that way in particular communities, not in a form of a loss that needs to be refound, but in a form of a way for the community to try to heal itself, right? In terms of moving forward. So immensely complex and interesting.
You probably have to log in again.
I'll probably have to log in again. Okay. Thank you very much. We'll just move on as if we magically have more stuff. But this became completely thrown on its head when we were talking about Africville, or when we went to Africville. So I don't want to take too much time up, and we can talk a little bit more in the Q&A about Africville and what is it. But essentially, it's a settlement, a black settlement that emerges in Halifax, Nova Scotia. There are waves of folks who come in to settle in this location, and that will include Jamaican Maroons forcibly stripped from the island and sent on boats and disembarked in Nova Scotia after the Second Jamaican Maroon War. That will also include black loyalists who are essentially promised by the British Empire that they would receive all sorts of beautiful land if they were to fight against the Americans, and waves of others. And they will end up in this subsistence space over a period of time. And what became critical for our project and for focusing on Africville is that Africville, and I've said this before at other sort of critical heritage events, but Africville, by the time we hit the 1960s, will be a place that Halifax is determined as a slum, and they want to take the land, and they will forcibly remove every inhabitant from that and disperse them around the locales. That's where I started my work in Africville, was really trying to understand that forced removal. I was really interested in what was that meant, because they were protesting at the time, and really working with human rights lawyers to essentially try to move stuff forward. And as I started going to Africville with my colleagues and collaborators, and we started really just sitting and engaging and listening to the community, it became fascinating to see that the community mobilized itself in the 80s. And one of the reasons it mobilized itself in the 1980s was that there were a number of young babies and elders who'd died and babies who'd been born, and they felt the community didn't know this. So they created a genealogy society. And it was really interesting that it was to reconnect through heritage that actually brought the community that had been dispersed all across the globe back together to essentially have what they call a reunion. They have a family reunion every summer that usually lasts the weekend. And almost as soon as that group got started and people started coming together, they started mobilizing. And then essentially demanded reparations from the city. A suit will be filed, and they will win that suit. That suit, again, going back to the period in the 1960s, one of the ways that the municipality removed people from the land was essentially to erase their church. But this is a community that had a toxic dump, an infectious disease hospital, prisons, all sorts of things surrounding it, abattoirs, in an effort to essentially force the people out, including creating a rail line that cut through the community that had no signage at all, and people had to try to move across this rail line. And so we became really interested as we continued to work with the Africville community to really get an understanding of all of these different experiences of Africville, from the people who were really young children at the time of the displacement to those who were activists at the time in the 1960s, all the way through to the other generation who had mobilized to create the Genealogy Society, and a completely other generation who only have memories of this place. They know it now as a park. They know it as a museum that has recreated the church that was raised in the middle of the night in the 1960s. They know it as this space where people come together, and they see it as this sort of celebration. But there are so many people in that community, even with this reparative work that's happened, that when they even think about Africville, all they feel is pain. So we became fascinated when we were ended up talking to people and trying to understand what does justice look like for this community in Africville? For some, it was reparations. For others, it was the idea of trying to get their land back. For others, it was trying to raise the profile and the heritage about Africville, because this is the type of language that had proliferated at the time and continues to proliferate now when people would talk about Africville. It kind of works in two ways. This is from a document in the 1960s. And it is written by social workers talking about Africville. And they were like, can a minority group be permitted to reconstitute itself as a segregated community at a time in our history, at a time in the social history of Western industrialized urban nations, when segregation either de jure or de facto is almost everywhere condemned? So there were those within Halifax that just could not imagine that a community like Africville should be permitted to exist. It would essentially be horrific for Halifax to allow this segregated space to exist. So they had to essentially break up the community. That was the logic for that set. And then, of course, there was the other set who were completely convinced that this was a slum. This is from 1957, again, social workers talking about the community. The citizens of Africville live a life apart. On a sunny summer day, the small children roam at will in a spacious area and swim with what amounts to their private lagoon. If you talk to the people who were kids at the time in the 1960s, that is their memory. Their memory is this place of immense freedom and a place of immense sort of security about their own bodily presence and being able to navigate the community. And they think about swimming and interacting, whereas they would not have been able to get jobs if they were older in Halifax. Most of the men ended up on either the railroad or doing subsistence, and the women overwhelmingly were domestics, but they were also small businesses in the Black community. And you get this sort of question of, in terms of the physical condition of buildings and sanitation, the story is deplorable. So when I was looking through the archive around Africville, I would hear that sort of language a lot. This language of deplorability or disease or something that is essentially horrific. When you would talk to Africville residents, and especially the generations later on, they see it as this idyllic moment that there was a Black haven in Halifax, where people essentially could mobilize and essentially live and share food and come together. So as I was looking across all these different archival kind of memories, and this includes going to the reunion. We went to the last one that was one of the big anniversaries, brought people together. There were about 2,500 individuals that were there for about a week. Music playing, food playing, church revivals, you name it, it was all happening within Africville. But there was still so much pain in that community that even with all of this reparative work, even with the types of development that the city had been involved in, even with the negotiations that the Genealogy Society and others had been involved with, even in the creation of a museum, injustice was still permeating, right? And it became really important for us to sort of reckon with maybe what we were presuming, this is us as a collaborative team, was that there would be a moment where people would be able to transition out of those feelings, right? That certain sets of conditions and things would happen, there would be this sort of archive, there'd be this sort of memory, there'd be scholarships that would be created, there would be this sort of work involved to repair sets of things, and the community would ultimately be able to heal. And in fact, what the community was telling us overwhelmingly was that was never gonna happen. No type of reparative work was going to ever deal with that pain of any kind. It didn't matter what kind of archive was created, what kind of celebratory kind of event. And what made matters probably worse was that as Africville became a kind of rallying cry for Canadians and people were putting material together, is that individuals lost the rights to their material. So not only do they have this sort of memory in relationship to where they sat in relationship to the protest movements, the series of movements, and the series of actual events interacting with Africville, they have really complex relationships to their own material. So that they would give photographs or information to the CBC, they would give information to various museums who wanted to do an exhibition, they would give them to a trust that wanted to do things, and they lost the rights to that material. So much so that now, if they want to put up their own pictures, pictures that individuals had had in their family albums, they have to pay somebody else for that copyright of themselves to be able to put those pictures up and to display them even in their own museum that they've got, that is the Africville Museum. So again, these sort of marks of injustice that sort of permeates across this space, which isn't about just trying to gather more material and try to give you another oral history project and ultimately, you know, try to display this again so that people know this history. It's a lot about the how. And I know that that is one of the things that we have taken away, especially from the Africville work, which is that these sorts of partnerships, these sorts of sets of interactions, this sorts of kind of knowledge goes well beyond just trying to tell the story and trying to understand the dynamics that have existed amongst different sets of people. It's all about relations. And these sorts of relations, these sets of entanglements between the residents themselves who do not agree about what's the way forward, but they are trying to work as a set, even if they have differing ideas and opinions. But it has to be considered the whole the various apparatuses that come at them. During the reunion itself, there was, we were part of the community at this point and had known that our job was not, cameras weren't out, we didn't have stuff in people's faces, so we were cooking food with the families that had adopted us, and we were being in place, and that was the way. But there were cameras from the BBC, there were cameras from the CBC. There was another guy that was going around asking people to essentially tell about their experiences. And it was really fascinating to watch people have to regurgitate that pain for different sets of people and perform it consistently. And that became the marker of their participation within these partnerships was that kind of performativity. And I, you know, maybe we'd learned a thing or two within our project and our partnerships, but we knew that that was something that was unacceptable as practice to continue. But it does leave us with a really big question, which is what's next? If we are thinking about trying to continue to do our work around critical heritage or history or marginalized people or majority people made to feel marginalized in certain sectors of the world, you know, we do have these critical questions, which is what is the type of work that we're engaged in? How do we fight against these various forms and patterns that replicate these sets of practices that essentially demands that people perform their pain for other people's consumption? Whether or not we try to mask it or you know, try to write a bow around it where we're trying to raise visibility or essentially raise awareness about a particular set of things, or even think that we're just documenting a set of circumstances. Because essentially, this is not neutral territory, right? We're talking about sets of things that are immensely quite charged. Now, I've raised a lot of questions. I've given you some glimpse of some of the ways that we're trying to think our way through some of this. But I'll be remiss if I didn't end with the point that says, I'm not satisfied even with this work. I'm not satisfied with these levels of partnership or engagement. And part of that is that I know I can ask more of myself. And I know that I need to ask more of the teams that I'm collaborating with and coming together to essentially walk this walk in everything that we do and every set of encounters that we're engaged in. And that also involves our sets of interactions and sharing and talking to other people. We have other things that we plan on doing back in Africville as well as in Nova Scotia. And I'm more than happy to talk a little bit about some of those in the Q&A. But I'm hoping that this sort of lends itself to start asking different types of questions about ruins. So there's a last line that's in the abstract that talks about injustice as a form of ruination. I haven't quite figured out what my brain was going with that. I really like it as a way to provoke me to think about this, about these sorts of perpetual type sets of workings and engagements, and what does it lend itself to over a long period of time if we're talking about injustices experienced by certain sets of people. And I think more importantly, what's my role in that? Now, I don't have any magic answers, but I would imagine with the collective knowledge that's in this room, the people who are watching online, and I think the larger critical community that's been grappling with some of this, that we can start moving into a place that we're starting to actually practice, and I do mean that in that sense, practice these types of transformations that we're engaged in. So thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much, Karen, for starting us off with some really interesting, very provocative questions that bear not only on the nature of the archive and the kind of variegated nature of the archive and its relationship to sociopolitics of heritage and present, but also about the research practices and approaches to dealing with this sort of material. So I think very rich and lots of really interesting points that we will hopefully be able to pick up on over the course of the next couple of days.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any immediate questions for Karen from the floor? Yes.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I don't know whether these will make sense to you, but I wondered something like repair. Does it always bring out the wound if you are going to go into material reparation?
Yeah.
And also about the partnerships. You talk about how, but is there also a question of why?
Absolutely.
And what does the funding institution want, if not to survive, unchallenged? So at the beginning you spoke about having to play a game.
The game that was was to fund a research project in a network.
And so I wondered what that does in terms of integrity. So that's one question. But I also wondered why the funding institution needs people to come to it who are playing games. Yeah. So
I wouldn't conflate that though, because the game playing I was doing was to because you're not supposed to do research in network projects. So I was actively trying to find a way to do research within networks, as opposed to what many people do in networks, which is they hold a conference like this, and it's not. I mean, it's true. And then they get a certain set of people, often quite elite, to come together to talk about something about other sets of people. Whereas we wanted to write a grant where it took us to communities where we weren't overprivileged in terms of our engagement, and we got to listen. So the fact that it was funded just meant that part of it was just the gatekeeping aspect of moving it into the program, but not that people wouldn't fund something like that, because obviously that one or the other sets of projects all received their funding. So there wasn't any game playing in the actual content of the information, and the notion of ethical partnership was front and center, and the issues around justice. So nothing was done within the actual content of the material to change that. Do you have some more?
Yeah, I was just really going to ask about the institution and their part, and also to suggest and put down the challenge that, there's some sort of war happening here, and I wonder what it is, why there is a need for organisations like your own to go into these communities, and is there some sort of interruption when that happens that is actually quite devastating in terms of healing?
Sure. To take the first part of your comment, because this was the Center for Research in Race and Rights is embedded within a university, and universities have their set of challenges and problematics. But I'm of the mind, as an entity looking at questions about power across multiple spaces, that universities are not special in terms of power imbalances. I see them in activist groups, I see them in charities, I see them in community groups, I see them in collectives of sets of people who are mobilizing for whatever reason that they're doing. So to somehow privilege those groups as being pure and universities as being the place that is tainted, my brain doesn't work that way. Because I mean
institutions generally.
Yeah. I do think when we start, because the thing about Africville is full of institutions itself. It has its genealogy society, it has its own museum, it has its own engagements that it's doing with the municipality, it's been engaging with various Christian faith networks and organizations. So there is not a space that you can imagine where the Africville community isn't dealing with or creating their own institutions, if you will. Now, there is a question of what does that mean for other sets of entities to interact with them. And I think that's where the ethical partnering comes from. Now, I wouldn't in any way deny that there could be dangerous sets of extraction and dangerous sets of connections where various entities, and this is in the community and outside the community, that have their own motivations. And that was transparent, just talking to people in Africville about groups that had emerged and the types of things that they were involved in, especially around what they denoted as repair. But having gone to the community and lived with families and actually becoming a family member with many of them and listening to what they wanted, it's meant that the next part of this network of thinking about these strategies of survival is actually listening to their strategies of survival and listening to what they want to communicate to other members within the diaspora. And I've really enjoyed this project to a large extent because it's been led by those communities we've interacted with. They're the ones who want to tell these stories to other sets of communities about, you think repair looks this way. Well, actually, it's not because it exposes the wound for some. For some, they live with that. They're okay with living with that wound, that they're all right with that. For others, they don't even want to talk about it, much less in the community. That is how that wound is. It's not even a wound as much as it is. It's sort of, well, I guess it is, but it's so traumatic that they don't even want to talk repair. They don't even want to start having the conversation. They don't want to join the genealogy society. They don't want to be a part of the museum. They don't want any of that work. And it was interesting to listen to people and respect that there are going to be these variances amongst how they ultimately want to try to tell the story, because the solution would be artists or writers should tell the story. Creatives should actually occupy the space, and some have made things, they have performed it, they've done various engagements. But when we were listening to folks who were saying, I just can't even come to the land where Africville was, to walk on that land is so painful to me that I don't want to see any of it ever again. I don't want anyone to write another play. I don't want any artist to create another piece. Much less a museum or something else. And that's where this is these really interesting questions to me about reparative work. Because questions around reparative justice often imagines that you're exposing or you're collectively grappling, and then you're moving to some other space with that emotion and that feeling, where there may be other entities or situations for set people that they can't walk that journey. And I think there's a question to be had around these moments of culture and heritage, which is, well, what does that look like? What's the responsibility? I mean, you've said about institutions, but I would say it's about every single individual. No matter if they're from the community or not, what is their responsibility about thinking about this form of repair? And what does that ultimately look like? And I think these are ongoing challenges. And I'll just say one final point. I think the same sort of challenge that I've put out today here is the same sort of challenge that I try to put towards myself as a scholar activist, as a person involved in many types of collectives and communities, but just trying to grapple with what does that mean to have certain sets of privileges, what does that mean to resist them, what does it mean to critically ask certain sets of questions, what does it mean to be in this building, in this part of London versus in another part of London, to constantly actually make that alive, as opposed to we just move past that to then do the work or do the practice or do the heritage work. And I don't think that there's every one of us will probably have our own answers to that, but for me, doing this kind of work often around injustices and inequalities, it's something that I try to keep alive for myself.
Just time for one more question here.
Thank you. From Coventry University. Thank you very, very much for a wonderful start to set up today. I have a question about the sort of multiple injustices there are, and thinking about the context of Africville. I wonder about the relationships between the population of Africville who came from Jamaica or in different ways as you've described, and the native Canadians.
Mm-hmm.
And whether there are alliances, whether there is a recognition of each other's wounds, or how that works.
I mean, they're a whole array because there are other black settlements around the basin and around Halifax. So Africville is one, there's some in North Preston, and there's others in various locations, and they all have very different sets of issues. Some, they are actually land rich, but cash poor, because they live in areas that nobody would want to live in now, and they're very rocky, and so they are prone to being scooped up by developers that are trying to come in and then move everybody out and then turn them into these big vacation home enclaves. That's happening on the other side of the basin. But Africville itself, because subsistence was a big thing for the community, and there's a large amount of fisher folk, they had exchanges with a number of indigenous communities that are around the basin. When we probe and kind of get people to kind of talk about it, a number of the older elders have passed on. So some of that knowledge of what would have been healing properties or various forms of growing food, because we're really interested in what food people ate now and trying to recapture some of the recipes. That's now gone. But there is very vital communities that are thinking about resistance in various ways, but they all have different ties to legal status. And different demands that they're asking of Halifax and the municipality, and even Nova Scotia. So it means that they are not thought of as a singular set of techniques that the municipality was engaged in. That then means that what is the repair looks different. Is it a treaty? Does it have a legal language that's attached to it, and we have the breaking of that in the form of Africville? This is a community that the municipality refused to bring roads and electricity to, or running water. So they essentially went through this whole process of pushing them out of the sort of legal status. And that's why they could look like this sort of erupting community, even though that was an intentional type of thing, although the community itself kind of came together. So it's complex, as it is in most of Canada. It's even more so in parts of Halifax, because Halifax is quite a big city. But the rest of Nova Scotia, where you start to move out into the more rural settlements, you really see the differences between the settlements that are in the city and the settlements that are further out, or in places like Quebreton or other locations. There are lots of folks who are really interested in trying to retell these older stories of Black migration throughout Nova Scotia, and where people went from Nova Scotia to various locations, because I'd be remiss if I didn't say some of the Jamaican Maroons went on to Sierra Leone. So there's a really big, longer arc story to talk about in terms of people coming from Jamaica into Africville, leaving Africville and going to Sierra Leone. And what does that actually tell us if we're thinking about sort of these questions of excavating resistance?
In terms of any kind of joint resistance, or?
There are groups that are doing things. But they are working for various different communities. There's been a fairly prolific project from one of my colleagues, Ingrid Walton, who is based in Halifax, who's looking at the various forms of environmental injustice of both communities, and then trying to convene things and bring both of the communities together at a singular event. About a thing, to talk about it as opposed to various community types of things. And that's going to move into documentaries with various other folks. But they're trying to do the breaching, but they are mobilizing differently, as opposed to thinking that they need to come together and why would they, to a certain extent?
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. So I'm keen to keep us on time, so perhaps we can bring any further questions into the tea break. But join me again in thanking Karen. So one of the things I forgot to mention is that this is actually the second conference that we've run with the German Historical Institute of London around similar themes. So in January last year, we ran a conference called Heritage Decolonisation in the Field, which I think several of the presenters and Indra was involved in. So this is part of a sort of ongoing set of collaborations around shared interests in the themes of this conference. And for anyone that is watching online, if you would like to see at least the keynote presentations from that conference from January last year, if you go onto our Heritage Research website and have a look in our events, there are links to the presentations that were given as keynotes under the conference entry that's Heritage Decolonisation in the Field conference. So we've got half an hour's break now, so I'll encourage you all to come across next door and have a cup of tea, and we'll make sure that we start back here at 11:45 sharp.
Welcome back, everyone. As you can see, despite our best efforts, technology doesn't always like to play along with people who dabble in heritage and history and that kind of stuff. We will wait for Nancy to sort out the technical problem that we're having at the moment, but while she does that, while Christoph and Nancy do that, let me briefly introduce the panel. It is really fascinating the way in which I think this program has been put together, because we have thematic panels interspersed with panels called counter archives, and I like the way in which the empirical stuff has sort of been married to the more conceptual and theoretical discussions, which I hope will continue in the course of the day. One of the very interesting things that Karen raised in her keynote was, of course, the fragmentary nature of archives. And I think that is really the central problematic of this conference. So I'm very happy to introduce our first session, which is called The State and the Community. The session consists of 3 presentations, but by several speakers. So we have a single presentation, and we have a joint presentation by 2 speakers, and we also have a single presentation from a group project. Are you ready? Yeah, oh, lovely. So Nancy is ready to go. The title of Nancy's paper, Nancy Rusho-Hora is our first presenter on this panel, and she is from the University of Stellenbosch, and she will be presenting on our ancestors, their heroes, contestation and appropriation of the Maji Maji war heritage in Tanzania. Nancy.
I'll be presenting about the Maji Maji War, and the Maji Maji War was a resistance against German colonization of Tanzania. The Maji Maji War took place in the southern part of the country, as you can see on the map, and it involved more than 20 different ethnic groups of southern Tanzania. Among the prominent ones were the Matumbi, the Ngoni, the Mwera, the southern coast all the way to its interior. And what was so unique about this resistance was the use of water as a bullet repellent, as a bullet proof. So it was surrounded by a ritual that by bathing or spraying water on your body, people would be immunized against the German bullets. And so people entered into that war with the mind of winning the war by using the ritual water. And the mastermind of that war was a ritualist by the name of Kinjekitile Ngwale. So it's a very unique resistance in Africa, and it is exemplary on its power to unite different ethnic groups, and also in terms of the tragedy after the war, because a lot of people died. To be exact, between 100,000 and 300,000 people died. And there is a contestation that it was a genocide as equivalent to that of Namaherero of Namibia. Now, what I'm presenting today is about the memory of the war, the landscape of trauma, and the government appropriation of these memories. So it has been a shared heritage. The Maji Maji War heritage has been shared among different groups. As I said, more than 20 ethnic groups participated, and these were different ethnic groups. So linguistically, geographically, they were completely different. So all these communities are trying to commemorate this resistance, and each particular community has his own heritage, forms of heritage. Within these communities are also the involvement of different religious groups, Islamic and Christians. Most of the leaders of the war were predominantly Muslims. So in their terms, it was a jihad. It was a resistance, a Muslim holy war against Christianization of southern Tanzania. So the Arabs, as you can see, it was along the coast. So Arabs came to the southeastern Tanzania coast around the 13th century, the Kilwa and other coastal city-states of that time. So the Arabs were the first incomers there, and Islamic religion spread to that region first before Christianity. But then with the colonialism came Christianity, and so they were the later group. So predominantly, most of the chiefs had already adopted Islamic religion, and they participated in the war. So they capitalized onto that to say that it was a war against Christianity, the spread of Christianity in the southern part of Tanzania. So numerous sites, including graves, memorials, are all part of the heritage they claim. And one of the interesting memorial is the one in Kilwa, where it was installed by the government in 1970s, but the Muslims have acquired that land to establish a commemorative mosque around the same land. Other sites that are also of interest into the Maji Maji story is a small museum that has been established in Songea, and also another two memorials that have been built by the government, but numerous have been constructed by the missionaries on sites where missionaries died. In number, a total of 11 missionaries died of the Maji Maji War in different sites of southern Tanzania. So as you can see here, these are various ways that the communities have tried to commemorate different sites of the Maji Maji resistance. And this in particular represents a photo that was taken during the time of execution of the Maji Maji victims. And this is a recent construction of a memorial at the same site, that site. And this one in particular is a very unique pictograph, I call it. It was, this and numerous others were drawn on paper, others on houses, and numerous on trees immediately after the war. And I get this pictograph from Colonial, a German ethnographer who was in southern Tanzania during the war. So these pictographs were collected in 1906. The war took place in 1904, 1908. So during the period of the war is when Colonial surveyed, walked through the Maji Maji landscape, and was able to bring up these forms of pictographs that were trying to explain the trauma and the memory, the encounter of violence with the people of southern Tanzania. And the different memorials have also been used differently by the community. So the memorials that are said they belong to missionaries, communities have been using the same memorials to narrate their own story about the Maji Maji War. One particular memorial is this one. As you can see, the pelican there is a memorial constructed in remembrance of Father Franciscus, who was killed during the Maji Maji War in Songea. Nobody was recovered, so nothing was buried there, but it's just a memorial erected there. So it is used during the Catholics' remembrance of the dead, and it is also part of the cemetery in Songea. But what is so unique is that when the Maji victims or descendants of the families trying to narrate about the Maji War, they refer to this particular memorial as evidence that we killed the missionaries there, and that's the evidence that we killed the missionaries. And another thing is that during the Maji commemorations taking place between the 25th and the 27th of February annually, during that period, the government and all officials will visit that memorial as part of the commemoration of the Maji War. Another is on the other side here, where this was a refuge of one of the prominent leaders of the Maji War. It was a refuge cave. Unfortunately, I didn't capture all the way to the cave, but I captured that particular place because it was used for a ritual dance overnight, a ritual dance that was conducted overnight on that particular site. And although these are both communities, so the ritualists and the grandsons of the victims of the Maji War, they are all in fighting about the same site using rituals. So the grandson and other victims of the descendants of the war, they want the site to be used for memory of the chief who used the site as a refuge. And this chief was by the name of Songea Mbano. But they are against the use by the ritualists, the herbalists, who are trying to use the same site, withdrawing on the power of the prominent leader of Ungoni. So these are both community, but they are antagonistic to one another against the use of the same site. And this cave is actually in a reserve which belongs to the Tanzania People Defense Force. So all these are happening in the same site. And these are the two mass graves, the two known mass graves of the Maji War. And all of which has, each of which has a very interesting story. The white one include the names on the memorial, include the people who died long before the Maji War occurred. So people who died during wars against the Germans, but before the Maji War, their names are also included in that memorial. And this is the site that I said it has been acquired by the Muslims to build a memorial mosque around that area. And the other one, it only have 66 names on it. Some of the names include people who were not executed there, but their names are included on the mass grave. And according to the archival document details that more than 100 people were actually buried in the mass grave sequentially in 2 different dates. This actually represents one of the first memorial of the Maji War. It was a site where a bishop was killed together with 2 missionary brothers and 2 missionary sisters. So 5 people were killed on that site. And it was first a mere cross engraved on the Amarula tree, which is now in the Selu Game Reserve in southern Tanzania. And later on, a memorial was constructed. Actually, the first memorial of the Maji War constructed in 1937. So this one is the oldest memorial of the war. But now it is used for pilgrimage among the Catholic congregation during particular times, and the Benedictine missionaries tend to visit this site, but it's not of use for the people of Liwale where this memorial belongs. Another important figure is the archive and how community have used the archive to suit their own need. The photo you see there is of Songea Mbano, the one I was referring to before about the cave. And it is the only photo that represents his image. It's the only image of the sub-chief that we have. And what is so interesting about this is that the photo is taken from the book by Fulabon on studies of race and type. It is this photo here, and it represents the true Mngoni in their connotation. But Songea Mbano was actually not a Mngoni. He was one of the slaves who was captured during the Ngoni migration from southern Africa, trekking all the way to Tanzania and other parts of southern Africa. So he wasn't even a Mngoni originally. But then he was used in the book by Fulabon to represent the true Wangoni. And now the photo is used in the museum as the only image of Songea Mbano that ever exists. And to fill in the absence of absence of these photographs and other images, these sculptures have been created in the Maji Maji Museum. So this is one of Songea Mbano, and numerous others surround the museum space. Some of them do not have images, it's just a name that she or he was among the people who died during the Maji Maji War. So this is how the community have tried to fill in the absence of images in the archive and other space. So to the government, the Maji Maji War is a very important event in the history of Tanzania. It is during the Maji Maji War that the nationalism of Tanzania is traced. They used this war as evidence of fighting against colonialism, initial evidence of fighting against colonialism, and of demanding for independence. They use Maji Maji War as also an example that Tanzania regained her independence without bloodshedding because of the lessons that were learned from the Maji Maji War, that it was impossible to win a colonialist by violence. So they went to struggle for independence by negotiations. So the lesson of the Maji Maji War is very important. Maji Maji War is taught as a lesson, as one of the topics in history, from primary school all the way to university level. But the memories of the Maji Maji War are just are scatters. These are scatters, as they are taught. They are scatters of evidence in history lessons. So there is misrepresentation. Commemoration of the Maji Maji War in the government side have been a commemoration of all the people who died during colonialism, like I represented in mass graves. And also in the National Memorial Maji Maji Museum, there is also this statue of Tanzania People Defense Force, the same museum. And this soldier, Tanzania People Defense Force, Askari, is actually there to commemorate another war, the Kagera War, whereby a battalion from the war, they died of a car accident. So this was installed in front of the Maji Maji Museum to commemorate another war in the same space. There are more to the Maji Maji War, particularly at the individual level. So when you encounter these memories from an individual level where you interview people, they speak about these memories completely different from what we learn in school. And this is my first encounter with the Maji Maji memories from the live memories of the people, apart from the ones that I used to learn from textbook. And it was completely different. Now, because my time is running, I wish to show a little bit of the video of how we are trying to document these memories and all these agencies who are coming together to contribute into the history of the Maji Maji War the appropriation of the memories, and the needs of the people from the ground.
Presentation.
in conclusion, the missionaries were one of the eyewitnesses of this war, and they have two archives in southern Tanzania, one located in Danda and another one located in Peramiho. Unfortunately, these two archives are closed to the public. Now we are in the process of negotiating, trying to see how we could be able to access these two archives. Thank you so much.
Reminded of a conference that we held in India last year on history textbooks, and there was a presentation by I forget the name of a textbook project from Palestine, which has two representations of the past from the Israeli and Palestinian side on either side of this. Was part of a UNESCO project, I think, which was partly successful, partly wasn't, but it's sort of I was reminded of that in your work. So we move to the final presentation of this session, and I'm very happy to invite Mirjam from UCL London to present from a collaborative project, right, that he's engaged in with Nasser A. Jassim from the University of Mosul, and also Caroline Sands, who's from ICOMOS, UK, who Caroline is also here, right. So, so may I invite you to present the final paper on the role of state access infrastructures in conceptualizing heritage post-2013 Iraq, an examination of Mosul University Library archives. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. This paper is a product of three researchers, myself, Caroline Sands, who is in the audience, and Professor Nasser Jassim, who was the previous director of Mosul University Library from 2003 to 2011. He couldn't be here. He wasn't able to make it because of visa issues. Not tied to the conference, actually, but he's a scholar under the Nahrain Network, British Institute for the Study of Iraq scholarship scheme, and he's been invited for 2 months to work at UCL on British Orientalism. He's one of the few researchers in Iraq who study British Orientalism. I have had many conversations with him and many of the other librarians in Iraq. Some of the issues obviously are pertinent to heritage studies in general, not just specifically about Iraq, because of the internationalized context that we have in the country. I'm going to be a bit boring today and just actually read. I don't have videos, but I do have nice slides, I think, some of them. I'll try to read very quickly because I have quite a few papers here, but I'll probably skip some of them. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Nahrain Network, which is a 4-year program based at UCL. It's a GCRF, AHRC funded program, and it's through that program the director is Professor Eleanor Robson, head of history department at UCL. It's through that program that I've come across some of the actors and partners and people who are working in heritage studies, in heritage in general in Iraq. Iraq is today one of the greatest tragedies of recent times. 3 decades of war, conflict, dictatorship, occupation, and terror have devastated its state institutions, communities, and cultural heritage. We find ourselves with a monumental task to come to terms with the change and destruction in the country. This presentation is an attempt to contextualize that destruction by looking at archives as a major component of Iraq's cultural infrastructure, which contributes to the foundations of a civil society. We initially looked at theories of state capture in relation to heritage institutions, but quickly realized that state capture alone was insufficient to explain heritage destruction, and that a broad understanding of politics concerned with international interventions could offer a more pertinent understanding. we thought that how political parties and domestic groups in Iraq worked to capture state institutions post-2003 could explain cultural degradation, destruction, but it was insufficient as the country's sovereignty has been shattered into pieces since the 1990s, more so from 2003. An understanding of such interventions and of those by domestic groups also is critical to looking at heritage in Iraq today. Heritage is indeed indispensable to the conduct of political life. It not only determines how society defines itself, but it is integral to the life trajectories that people follow, and ordinary people follow. In a way, heritage, whether tangible, intangible, documented, or undocumented, is a living archive of people and a history of the societies and states in which they live. If we are to view heritage and political trajectories as inextricably intertwined, then archives could be considered store of life's history. Archives then are depositories of the past and integral to a society's sense of belonging. What happens to archives in particular, how they are used, manipulated, instrumentalized, erased, and abused, can tell us a lot about what is happening in society. Destroying archives is a particular attack on the state and on its people. It removes evidence of a shared history, of the longevity of that history. We also require stories to make sense of the world, and archives facilitate that. They are perhaps the single most important thread of continuity in a society. And we've looked at different types of archives. Archives and libraries are a very specific form of state infrastructure. What people access, how they do it, are critical to the constitution of life and people's relationship to the world around them. If archives are destroyed, spirited out of the country, abused and undermined, it can lead to a situation of dictatorship, brutality, chaos, and ignorance. The weakening of the Iraqi state after the Gulf War, the weakening of the Iraqi state after the first Gulf War in 1991 was a key turning point. Advocates of the liberal peace would argue that Iraq lost sovereignty and that intervention was a rightful course of action. Comprehensive international sanctions in the 1990s, which undermined state institutions and social structure in the country, created conditions for the systematic degradation of Iraq's cultural infrastructure. Iraq's sovereignty was undermined gradually, and so was its cultural infrastructure. To date, neither have been reconstructed. And we are now in a situation where large swathes of Iraq's cultural heritage is no longer in the possession of Iraqis. It has been enlisted to serve non-Iraqi interests, appropriated for alternative political projects, states, and societies. US, European approaches champion nebulous notions of community that are ill-defined and often instrumentalized to realize a specific objective. Such a focus is surprising, given the amount of state destruction and the degradation of state institutions that are designed to promote and protect heritage in the country. What we have witnessed in recent years and before our eyes is the destruction of one of the world's most important depositories of past civilizations, to the point that material from illicit looting is now in open display in museums that have been created based on looted artifacts and archives. I'll show you here. This is a museum in Lebanon, which was recently, a private museum which was recently opened, and a significant number of its materials are actually from Iraq, from the 1990s. Open display. And again here, you see, going back to some of the things we've spoken about, Israel and Palestine, again, in open display. We have, How did we get to this surreal situation where a country's national archives of its communities, societies, histories, civilizations, and accomplishments have yet again become under the ownership of non-Iraqis who have neither access to it as others do? If we are to use a concept of counter-archives, we would argue that the concept could be pertinent to an understanding of Iraq's cultural situation. We'd argue that there are several components of a counter-archive in relation to Iraq. In particular, a counter-archive could be viewed in relation to alternative ways people access information about themselves and about the state. In particular, we would argue that the post-2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq attempted to create new forms of access and relationships to Iraq's history, one that was intimately tied to US occupation interests. Access and use of these divided up or removed archives is therefore rendered exclusively for the consumption of those who possess them. They become appropriated by others who make claims on another country's heritage. We could call this the non-archive, or the blank slate approach to archives, where post-2003 looting and absent US interest in protecting heritage was a deliberate policy to undermine Iraq's linkages to its past and to create a new Iraq beholden to new scripts dictated in large part by its engagement with the US. Those legacies, that blank slate notion of an archive where all things start from zero, are vividly with us today. You can see here, Hobby Lobby, a major company in the US, recently repatriated 4,000. That kind of liberalization of Iraq's cultural heritage post-2003, which we continue to see the legacy of, is now across the region in terms of artifacts in the Middle East, with the museum I've just shown, and with organizations that purchased this quite openly. The second feature of a counter-archive is the one associated with the hollowing out of Iraq's archives and their appropriation by interest groups, states, and governments outside the country. In this case, like the blank slate approach to Iraq's cultural infrastructure, an archive here is one that is no longer an integral part of the country from which it emerged. For example, the removal of the Iraqi Jewish archives and the Ba'athist archives are two glaring cases. Their removal from Iraq means that the future generations of Iraqis no longer have access in their country to such important materials and histories of their people. These two collections, respectively, of a 2,000-year-plus old community, Jewish community in Iraq, and a 4-decade dictatorship of Saddam Hussein, are no longer available in Iraq for future generations. This removal of crucial archives has happened again recently with the smuggling out of ISIS documentary material by a New York Times journalist. These removals to the US of the Ba'athist and more recently the ISIS archives severely compromises their use to prosecute, exonerate, understand, and learn, something generally considered crucial in post-war reconciliation. We would argue that the removal of archives from Iraq is an attack on Iraq's sovereignty and its existence. It is by all means an attempt to create a monochrome society that does not learn from the past and is more likely to lose its cultural diversity and richness. A third feature of a counter-archive, and especially in relation to post-2003 Iraq, is one that could be seen in relation to the efforts to appropriate knowledge by special interests, religious groups, and political parties within the country. Political parties and religious groups in particular have attempted, some successfully, to create new archives, counter-archives, which underpin their parochial politics. The spiriting out of Iraq's archives, Ba'athist archives, and the ISIS archives, and the Jewish archives, and so much else, has created a ripe situation for this to happen, where religious groups and ethno-nationalists, in pursuit of an ethno-state, for example, have found it easy to do, given the hollowing out of archives that evidence Iraq's rich cultural history. In Iraq's case, the absence of a historical record of diversity could very well mean that it becomes easily subsumed in regional forces that attempt to create a religiously hegemonic structures based on religion or parochial identities. In recent years, political parties have constructed competing structures built on fragments of Iraq's national heritage, creating a situation where groups' politics and legitimate rights to the riches of the state is inextricably connected to the heritage it claims ownership over. Heritage possesses the means to confer legitimacy and by extension access to enormous oil rent here, particularly state rent, for competing groups in society. Heritage and archives and how they're used and instrumentalized affects people's access to the state. It also affects political parties' ability to enter, access, and maintain linkages to the resources of the state, in a way reinforcing vicious cycles of rent-seeking. Such relationships affect how we view heritage, including state and non-state organizations, museums, archives, temples, churches, mosques, synagogues, and other cultural sites. An example of this was the Ministry of Endowments and Religious Affairs Central Library. This is Awqaf, this is the Sunni Endowment Library. One of the oldest depositories of manuscripts in Iraq. It suffered deliberate burning and looting. The restoration of this collection was subsequently further complicated by the splitting up of the Ministry of Endowments, this is after 2003, into directorates, Shi'i, Sunni, religious minorities, in tandem with Iraq's political quota system imposed from 2003, which divides Iraq's resources and its institutions to competing political parties. Like many cultural sites, they have been parceled out to what is considered to be their respective religious communities, a form of divide and conquer that savagely complements the damage and destruction of cultural heritage sites and depositories, allowing different actors to control different aspects of Iraq's cultural heritage for their own benefit while excluding others, and one that works against social cohesion and actively sabotages any consensual faith in a shared history. We would argue that archives and counter-archives are an emblematic of political struggle, occupation policies, and post-2003 liberalization of Iraq's cultural heritage, and over the long term produces different approaches about how people access their histories. In the past few years, there have been hundreds of seminars and lectures on illicit trafficking and cultural heritage, cultural property, but little, if any, communication with the people who have been directly affected by war and those whose archive have been damaged, destroyed, stolen. Yesterday, I spoke to one of the main people in the Awqaf library. This is in Mosul. ISIS had plundered 8,000 important manuscripts. Not much has been written about this. This is basically the Ottoman presence in the country, and it was stored in the Sunni Endowment Library, which had 8,000 manuscripts. Not one piece of paper was left. 8,000 manuscripts stolen, plundered. Total erasure of Iraq's history, particularly its northern history and the Ottoman relationship. You can see here, this is a picture from 2010, and this is just a recent picture. Empty shelves. Mosul University Library was opened, and can I just say also a point regarding that? So I spoke to the head of this previous library, who's now in the Mosul University. He did not receive one phone call, whether from the Iraqi government, whether from international organizations, from UNESCO, whether from international academics, not one phone call. And he was in charge and responsible for this library, meaning that he has a significant store of information about about this archive. And there are no efforts to retrieve these archives. Mosul University was opened in 1967, and in the 1970s, a central library was built. It was one of the largest, most advanced libraries of its time in the region. This was open to all university employees. In the early 80s, Iraq had formal subscriptions to thousands of periodicals. The Iran-Iraq War caused suspension of funding to libraries, and Mosul received no new books. The library and more broadly Iraq's cultural infrastructure was severely degraded by sanctions, where salaries plummeted to a few dollars a month. By 2003, the situation was dire, and the library was looted for one day only. That's quite good by Iraqi terms, before concerned citizens stepped in to save it from further looting. After 2003, the US aid interventions attempted to improve the library, the building, and its cataloging system, but this had little, if any, impact. The systems were all blueprint models and efforts fraught with corruption. Again, education and culture were not major priorities for US aid, the largest donor in the country over the past few years. Mosul University was severely undermined by the university's management, its own management, which prioritized buildings over content. Mosul University spent $2.5 million rehabilitating the building, the Mosul University building, on cheap plastic cladding, drainage systems for the library, but no real effort was made to create a digital system in the library to document, to digitize its collections, which could have cost about $100,000. By 2014, just before the takeover of Mosul by Daesh, the library was still predominantly using a card-based system for classification, cataloging. The war on ISIS and ISIS have destroyed the library that had over 1 million items, 40% of which was in English and the rest in Arabic and regional languages, Persian and Ottoman and so on. Other libraries too were destroyed, including the public library and, as I've just said, the Awqaf library. So this is from the Awqaf library, and these are the kind of sort of manuscripts that were stolen. And this is the library, and just here is the building before the rehabilitation. This is the cheap plastic cladding. Could a strategic intervention have helped to save it from total destruction, the situation of Iraq's changing hyperpower? I would argue yes. Just a point, I forgot that the German government is actually rehabilitating this building. Okay? And this is the Mosul University Library, and there's a grant of about 11 million euros to rehabilitate it with the support of UNDP. It is a tragedy, having experienced 2003, that such looting, destruction, lack of emergency planning could occur again. According to the library representatives who lobbied the university, no support was given to support their cause. It is in times like these that we should be cognizant of changing local politics. We need to establish credible and equitable partnerships that are not only project-based, but are about long-term friendships, networks, and cultural exchange. This is particularly important in the context where significant elements of Iraq's cultural heritage are now found in Western museums and cultural institutions. If these kinds of credible and equitable partnerships had existed, we could have saved a large part of the library's rare books and holdings, which could have been at least digitized, yet no real interest was shown, even in the years of relative peace in Iraq, and there were some years of relative peace. This paper is a call to understand how people access the state and their archives. How people access state institutions can be a lens to help contextualize, understand, and strengthen how we view heritage, concepts such as community values, memory, sustainability in conflict-affected countries, which are closely bound by political actions of competing political forces in the country. In the words of the former director of Mosul University Library, Professor Nasser Jassim, the library itself and the archives is a microcosm of the tragic events that have befallen Iraq and the Iraqi state of the past 3 decades. I'd just like to mention a few things. So this is the library, destroyed, and these are the remaining collections, newspapers, local newspapers from about 130, 140 years ago, and up to the 20s, 30s. Very important. These need to be digitized. The libraries were not just a store of knowledge, but integral to Moslawi history. And without that, as we've seen in the country, that places like Mosul could be more prone to extremist views and the projects of competing political actors. Elif. So a new organization was established recently called Elif, based in France, and it's designated $900,000, I believe, so it says, to support the rehabilitation of libraries. I don't actually think Mosul University Library is included. I spoke to the Chancellor and I spoke to the head of the library, but it wasn't included. I'm really surprised why it wasn't, but a conversation to have with them. Projects like this are essential. Emergency heritage funding. This is also other countries in Mali, Afghanistan, Syria, I think. Why did these projects only start now, after 15, 16 years of massive destruction? Why did this kind of project not start in 2003, 4, and 5? It actually took Daesh, ISIS, and the threat from Daesh to our own countries in the West to create something like this. We need greater understanding of heritage locally to create major programs like this. The programs, and just going back to USAID, and I haven't spoken much about USAID, spent billions, tens of billions on women's issues, human rights. When it came to heritage and culture, it would be a couple million, 15, 20 million at the most. Absolutely appalling, not commensurate with the damage inflicted on the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the panel for some truly wonderful papers and for being relatively good with time as well. So I think we'll have to eat a little bit into the lunch break, maybe about 5 minutes, so we have about 20 minutes for discussion. Can I ask the panel to come forward and take your seats, and then we can take some questions from the audience.
We have now the first of 2 sessions which we've called imaginatively Counter Archives 1 and 2. But we thought that there was a cluster of papers that really sort of dealt with this question of counter archives, both the kind of nature of the counter archive and different ways of engaging counter archives in one way or another. And in this first session, we have another 3 papers that will do the same format as before, where we give each speaker 20 minutes, and then I'll cut you off if you overrun, and then we'll have time to, at the end, to save your questions and take the questions collectively for the group. So I'm very pleased now to present Wendy Shaw. who will be presenting on From Preservation to Sustenance, Re-engaging the Socratic Present Tense.
So thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to start out by sharing a story with you. Now, often this manuscript painting is understood as just being a painting in a manuscript of the Khamsa, which is 5 poems by Nizami, and it's from the 12th century. And it's a very famous painting, and it's a very famous painting because it has this amazing image of ruins. And so I'm going to frame my talk, which is going to be less about the Islamic world, but actually I come to the Platonic through the Islamic world, with this vision of ruins. Okay, so in this story, King Anushirvan has gone hunting, and he has his vizier with him, and they come across these ruins. And his vizier is very, very special because he has the capacity to speak with animals and understand animals. And so King Anushirvan looks up, and he sees these 2 birds who are chatting at the top of the ruins. He says to his vizier, tell me, what are they saying? And the vizier kind of doesn't really want to say. And then he says, no, really, I want to know. And so he says, well, the birds are saying, you know, if you don't have enough ruins now, don't worry. There will be more soon because the king is not doing a very good job. So King Anushirvan takes this to heart, and he makes sure that he's doing a good job after that. Okay, so what's going on in this story? First of all, I want to talk about that we think of this as a manuscript painting about ruins. And in doing so, we're missing the point of the story, which is that the story isn't really about ruins. It's about how we think about meaning and things being alive as opposed to things being dead. That is, we have a frame which is about the tension between mortality and immortality. Do things get to be kept forever? Or must things die? How must things die? What does that even mean? So even when we quote what's on this page, which is, built up in the desert heart of those deprived of bliss, there is no better building than this in this ruined world than this. So for us, we're looking at a prince looking at ruins, but let's pause a moment and look at the couplet. Built up in the desert heart of those deprived of bliss. Okay, bliss, of course, is being with the divine. If you're deprived of bliss, that is, you're deprived of the divine, your heart is a desert. It's not fertile. So the world is a place which is deprived of the divine. So in the desert heart of those deprived of bliss, there is no building in this ruined world better than this, right? Or no better building, right? So this is the best you can do in a place which is already separated from the divine, is the recreation of the divine. Is what's being talked about ruins? No. What's being talked about is justice. So ruins, they're a metaphor. Now, when I was looking at this, I was thinking about, I've been looking at a lot of poetry lately, and I wanted to think about what different legacies can we think this poem through. And I'm very conscious that one of the legacies is the Platonic legacy, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But also the Chinese legacy also comes in. And I'm just starting this research, so this isn't firm or anything. But I came across this poem, which is from China. It's from the 12th century. And it's about birds and ruins. The noisy, hungry sparrows are fighting with each other while there is only one butterfly alone. Among splendid palaces, I spot piles of ruins. Who could penetrate the subtle meaning of the old man, that is the painter, Huang Quan? In this painted image, there's criticism of the emperor. So I couldn't find any paintings of this specific thing by Huang Quan, but he's a very famous bird painter from the 10th century. And though we look at these paintings as though they're nice, pretty pictures of birds in a Chinese style, actually somebody who was reading them critically right afterwards was able to see the metaphor of sparrows, or regular, everyday working people, who are struggling to find sustenance among ruins, and ruins are there because somebody is mismanaging the government. Okay, so I wanted to sort of frame this discussion about ruins and real ruins within this broader idea that ruins are not a metaphor for time travel, which is how we always take them, but they're also often a metaphor for loss and a metaphor for warning. And I wanted to pull us out of the ways in which dominant cultural paradigms have us think of the ruin. So it's all about the struggle for immortality. Recognizing the fact that we ourselves will die, we project ourselves into that other thing that will not. It may be a god, but for a few centuries, it's not really been God. And in this time, something incredible has happened. Humanity has invented a means of stalling time by holding on to things in the image of that which they must have once have been, with a ferocious insistence that truth must like an origin, and that all change is corruption, for in corruption lies ultimately death. And so this woman who spun her wool among the ruins in a village called Geire, she spun her wool just as may have been done for centuries. She becomes the interloper. And this archaeologist, who unearths and rebuilds the ruins beneath her feet, becomes the one who resurrects against the damage inflicted by the lives led as the land has traversed time. For it's not time that passes, but us who passes through it, like a thread through the eye of a needle. And I don't know if it's possible to say whether the front of the thread is more valuable than the last in stitching together what remains of that history. So in thinking about this, I'm looking at this village of Geire, which I've written about before, and what does it mean to own this village? We have villagers who've somehow ended up in this space. They are living there. They're integrated with these ruins. And through a process of archaeology and scientific knowledge, they've been removed to another village. We already saw this with Susia. And now there are new owners, which is the nation state, but actually it's the temporary owners who come there, the tourists, who end up owning the space. So going to Palmyra, also famously owned by tourists, I think it's possible to say that the greatest value of a village may live in the flow of water from its source, and how that water sustains the population, but also mixes with the soil to plaster the walls of the village that have grown between the columns of ancient ruins. More lies in this living town than that town when it is swept away, to become something it never was, a blank slate of columns as indicated in the lower picture, empty of people and fertile for the European imagination to come, to conquer, and to own. The promise of preservation is a promise of immortality. It exists in the name of what has been, but only to hide the aim of those who create it, to render their vision of themselves as immortal. All this to express the danger of preservation, which we have come to take as though it were a common good. When dreams, such as the dream of Ezekiel, become material, they can no longer be freely owned by each dreamer. To own something means not to share, means to kill the place in favor of holding on to the dream, and in the end, really to be left with nothing but a shell. Ezekiel's dream of Solomon's temple remained as safe as Muhammad's dream of the farthest place of worship before each became materialized. Was Judaism any poorer before the Jesuit priest Juan Bautista Villalpando of Córdoba, a man of Jewish descent, sketched out the temple, or before the Portuguese Jewish scholar Jacob Yuda Leon Templo distributed the print he made of the reconstruction of the dream? And does it become richer if it destroys the temple, built in honor also of Solomon, but by that other faith, who built on the ruins of what the Romans had once destroyed and now are left out of the story? Who wins from this sequence of destruction and reconstruction and destruction and reconstruction? I want to say the conquerors or the concrete makers, but in the end, I fear it's no one. To raise also means to raise. And what if all the artifacts once taken from Africa were given back? Then would colonialism finally be laid to rest? Or is there plenty more culture or vibranium back where it came from to make that which was taken meaningless in the face of the unredeemable suffering inflicted in the taking? I don't think there's a way of making good on that past, whatever is or isn't given back. Repatriation of artifacts is far from restitution for colonialism, even when people pretend it's the same thing. And I don't think there's such a thing as redemption. There's only repetition. The model of preservation, I think, needs to shift so that we focus not so much on keeping forms, but on thinking and maintaining through their living meanings, a process which I'm going to call sustenance. Now, this is a complicated proposal, since the premise of conservation is to keep that which is of tangible value as a marker of presence, often when a people no longer inhabits a place. It serves absolutely laudable aims, in this case, such as the maintenance of cultural diversity and thickness over time, even when the peoples who created a legacy no longer manifest a presence, often through force. The opposite of such preservation is often taken as destruction, a forced erasure of a place, often valorized through preservation. What concerns me is that both the preservation and the destruction valorize the object as presence. That is, they valorize the idea of writing. And what I'm concerned about is how can we valorize things as though they were speech? So I'm going to talk more about this opposition between writing and speech in a minute, because that's where I'm getting to Plato. So choosing what can stay and what must go is a manifestation of power. So this is a complicated story. This is what happened in the city of Diyarbakir, Ahmed, in 2016. A site was preserved as a World Heritage Site, and it was immediately razed right afterwards by the Turkish government. It's been largely forgotten. So it was a performance of preservation and destruction on multiple sides. But at least the World Heritage designation made it slightly visible. But right after, the World Heritage Organization had a meeting in Istanbul, kind of showing what visibility is worth. Okay, so preservation alone. The problem is that preservation alone is never sufficient. In the United States, mounds made by native peoples have been physically maintained, but their discourse has been mystified, attributing their construction to ancient peoples, even aliens, in order to deny the complexity of the native civilizations who conceived, executed, and lived in them. Preservation alone all too often depends on the reification of physical forms without concurrent attention to the discursive frameworks that keep giving them meaning, and in doing so, keep them alive. Okay. The form of the Hittite sun monument in Ankara serves as a popular means of affiliating modern Turks with an ancient Hittite identity, and thereby functioned as a symbol of secularism of the modern state until the early mid-2000s. Nobody really knows entirely what this was, but the emptiness of a vessel only amplifies the potency of the meaning that comes to fill it. The only way preservation can really happen is not simply in the maintenance of things, but in the sustenance of their meanings. I find this idea in Henry Bergson's idea of duration. Pure duration is the form which the succession of our conscious states assumes when our ego lets itself live, when it refrains from separating its present state from its former states. It both forms the past and the present states into an organic whole, as happens when we recall the notes of a tune, melting, so to speak, into one another, comparable to a living being whose parts, although distinct, permeate one another just because they're so closely connected. Sustenance, the notes of a tune sustained, so thinking of objects as music. thinking of objects as sustenance, that which feeds us. And yet, the painful part, that which also inevitably falls away. Al-Jahiz of Baghdad pointed to the mortality of things when he expressed the necessity to recycle ideas. The composing of books is more effective than building in recording the accomplishments of the passing ages and centuries, for there is no doubt that construction eventually perishes, and its traces disappear, while books handed from one generation to another, and from nation to nation, remain forever renewed. A note cannot be sustained unless it is picked up by another note, sustained from instrument to instrument, song to song, performance to performance, performer to performer. We see this as well in the discourse of Socrates, who explains that the problem with writing is that it is speech that loses the capacity to defend itself. For knowledge to maintain truth, it must remain alive in discourse. While it may be written, its presence has to be bandied about, performed, retained as a living force, even at the risk that this must inevitably alter its mortal being. What we call preservation falls within the category of writing and painting for Socrates. Writing has this strange feature, which makes it truly like painting. The offspring of painting stands there as if alive, but if you ask them something, they preserve quite a solemn silence. Similarly with written words, you might think that they spoke, as if they had some thought in their heads, but if you ever ask them about any of the things they say out of a desire to learn, they point to just one thing, the same each time. And when once it's written, every composition trundles about everywhere in the same way, in the presence of those who know about the subject and of those who have nothing at all to do with it, and it does not know how to address those it should address and those it should not. When it is ill-treated and unjustly abused, it always needs its father to help it, for it is incapable of either defending or helping itself. And so preservation needs to be the father and the mother of that which is kept, so that it can keep speaking. The solution Socrates offers is one of sustenance, for the one who seeks to maintain truth will not be in earnest about writing his pieces of knowledge in water, in black water, sowing them through a pen with words that are incapable of speaking in their own support and incapable of adequately teaching what is true. Instead, he will teach. He will find a fitting soul, and in it, he plants and sows in words accompanied by knowledge, which are sufficient to help themselves and the one who planted them, and are not without fruit, but contain a seed from which others grow in other soils, capable for rendering that seed forever immortal, and making the one who has it as happy as is possible for a man to be. Like the promise of preservation, the promise of sustenance is none other than immortality, where the one rests on keeping things, on writing, the other rests on sustaining ideas through communication, not the presence of a single person so much as the maintenance of discourse around people and things in the realm where ideas circulate. That is also books, and it is also writing, and it is also things. But it can never be these things alone. In ballet, it is the movement between the forms that creates the dance. And so it is with knowledge, with that which must be rendered immortal, with that which must be sustained. So, thank you.
Very much on time, Wendy. I was about to hold up the 1 minute card. Thank you. As I say, do hold your questions for the end, and we'll bring everyone together at the end. I'm pleased now to invite to the podium Rishika Mukab.
Yeah, it's a long one.
Can you tell me how to pronounce it? Sorry, I should. Mukhopadhyay. Rishika Mukhopadhyay is a PhD researcher at the University of Exeter, and she'll be presenting to us on heritage through making practices, engaging with the living craft tradition of Chitpur Road in Kolkata. Now let's see if we can bring up your presentation.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present my paper here. So this is very much part of my ongoing PhD research, and I have just come back from my field. So what I'm going to present here is very much some reflections and tensions that I have gathered from my very recent fieldwork. And I will take you with me to the field and share some of the conundrums that I'm having after coming back. And through this, I'll attempt to problematize the recent debates around critical heritage studies from the vantage point of Global South. In most part of the non-Western world, conservation of past through safeguarding of physical object is an imported concept. How else can heritage be conceptualized here? In this paper, I will engage with a kind of heritage which is not preserved by any state agencies, but it is kind of lived and enmeshed within people and landscape through practice rather than any external intervention. So I'll take you to the history of the street first, because I'm gonna narrate some stories from it. So this is Chitpur Road in the eastern metropolitan city of Kolkata, which was founded as a city around late 17th century by the British as a trading port. So from the middle of 18th century till the beginning of 19th, it saw magnificent and luxurious city homes of Bengali Hindu elites who made huge fortune by developing commercial connection and working closely with the British Raj. Under their patronage, many craftsmen came from nearby villages and settled in densely packed settlements around these big mansions. The elite also established bazaars, like marketplaces. It became an unique place in the city where a plethora of artifacts were made and sold simultaneously. With a combination of traditional craft and artisanal trade, the road became the trading center of the city. The practices also modified rapidly in response to the industrializing, modernizing colonial metropolis. It supported the growth of the metropolis by attracting a large number of foreign nationals like Jews, Chinese, Armenians, migrants from other minority religious backgrounds, and other regions from India as well. And it rendered the road its very present diverse demographic character. The road also showcased plethora of activities through its 4-kilometer long stretch, and they are mostly idol-making practices, sculpturing, gold and silver jewelry making, old printing presses, handmade book binding, folk theater offices, iron, brass, aluminium utensils trade, bamboo craft, wooden Sandesh mold. Sandesh is a sweet meat, mold making, musical instrument making, and the list can go on. Some can be traced back to the city's inception, and some are centuries old. Some are in a very languishing stage. Some are still thriving. Some activities remained genealogical. For some, they have absorbed outside labor force, where the present generation is only managing the business rather than making the artifacts by hand themselves. So I will now share some of the vignettes from the field. First, I will take you to a workshop of an idol maker to understand the visceral nature of everydayness of working and living along the road. Next, I'll tell you a story of a wooden mold maker, and in the end, there's a narrative about an external stakeholder in this area. And through these stories, from two very different spectrum of heritage discourse, we will see how they interact with each other. I ask how these two groups, a community of craftspersons and civil society, interact with the burgeoning heritage industry of this city, and what implications do they have on each other. My intention is to see how different groups of people understand, deploy the category of heritage. On one hand, I have done detailed ethnography with 4 different craft community. And on the other hand, I was also actively engaged with this artist collaborative who wants to reactivate the area through collaborative community art practice. So these different stakeholders carve out very nuanced understanding of heritage. Along with the question of consciousness of past and history, they also give very close attention to material work, labor. So first, I'll talk about the Idol Makers Workshop. So it is the neighborhood of Kumatuli, and it supplies the city all kinds of religious idols throughout the year. It was past lunch hour when I reached Kumatuli in early days of September last year. I entered Didi's workshop and found no one was there. I was about to step out when I heard some voices coming from above asking me to wait for Didi in the studio. As I looked up for the first time, I realized what I thought as a roof or ceiling of the studio made by wood panel is actually a small compartment, horizontal compartment, where easily 4 or 5 people can sleep together, but they definitely cannot sit up straight in that space. There is a ladder which goes up to the first loft, and that first loft works as a standing base for the person to squeeze inside the next loft, which is at the left, and spread towards the entrance. They are primarily used for the workers, just enough space for them to sleep at night and take rest in the afternoon. There is a narrow passage in the middle, and all the idols are kept either right or the left. The only permanent construction in the room is a table-like structure. There are heaps of sacks stored around the table. Seems like it is a structure which was originally built to store clay, but now sacks and ropes and plastic sheets, they're all entangled inside this square hole. A giant rat has found home inside it. The studio has no cemented store or concrete roof. It is a 20 by 20 room with 17 life-size idols cramped inside. It is covered with thick plastic sheets from outside and thatched with a cane material. There is no door in the studio as well. The front is completely covered by a blue plastic sheet. It can be folded up to let the sunlight in or pulled down when it rains outside. The uncemented, undulating, muddy floor of the studio has been extended at least 7 feet towards the main road, crossing its original floor area. On the floor, various molds of faces and fingers were lying around. Some plastic teacups were also seen discarded on the floor. On the right, a common toilet facility is visible. Even if one misses its presence, it's present right beside a religious idol-making workshop. The stench from the toilet is so powerful that it will proclaim its own presence. I stepped outside for some fresh air and noticed a public dustbin just opposite side of the road, and a dead cat was lying around in the bin, in front of the bin, to be picked up by the municipal cleaners next morning. So this is Kumatuli, the adobe of god makers, where Hindu gods incarnate their mortal forms each year. Conveniently located by the river, unfired clay is the material basis of their creation. They make gods and goddesses rise from the clay of river. The idols then travel through the road and goes to homes of the aristocratic families and in numerous neighborhoods for community worship purposes. After the worship festival, they are immersed in the river again, so that next year the process can start all over again. In Kumatuli's narrow lanes, small dwellings, makeshift workshops, reside and work at least 500 artisans. Another 2,800 migratory laborers come and live here every year to help the master artisan. Their sweat and blood is inscribed on every idol that has a master artisan's name on it. During the 5-day-long grand and spectacular festival, the city generates, the Kumatuli only generates 2 to 3 billion worth of business, yet their work and living condition remain humble. Much like the idol's transient life, the life of the labor is seasonal, the workshops are makeshift. Their life is a living embodiment of creation as well as destruction. Kumatuli is that place which holds the essence of ephemerality in life. Therefore, they don't fall under any grade 1, 2, or 3 category of Kolkata Municipal Corporation's graded list of heritage building. Despite that, it is one of the oldest neighborhood in the city, which was established after the name of this particular artisan caste, not class. Caste means a group of people who were by birth destined and designated to make these idols and earthen vessels back in the 18th century. With time, it has been dynamic. It has changed and challenged social norms. Once a profession solely dwelled by men of the artisan caste, women have gradually claimed the space. They are always innovating, diversifying, playing with materials, forms, and structures. From clay, they have experimented with fiberglass, plaster of Paris to export the idols abroad. From religious idol making, they have ventured into making statues, busts, and sculptures. Yet, Kumatuli is synonymous with the city's artistic heritage, its living, rich tradition. It has made a niche for itself as a quintessential heritage space in the city. Our next stop is a wooden Sandesh mold maker's shop. In Chitpur area, among 7 wooden utensils selling shop, only 4 are still making hand-carved wooden molds. Rest are mostly sourcing them from craftsmen working out from nearby villages. Narayan Das, in his 50s, is the owner of one shop, and he says that his father was the pioneer of wooden Sandesh molds. His family occupation was of a carpenter, and he has heard from his mother that his grandfather used to be a carpenter in one of the big houses in the street. So he was the shopkeeper as well as an artisan, and many of them continue to perform both the role as shopkeeper and artisan. Narayanda estimates that the shop is around 120 years old, but they don't keep track of such dates and records. Everyone in the row used to make wooden printing blocks. These demand for wooden printing blocks stopped completely around 20 years back, and those who could only transfer their skills to make Sandesh mold survived in this trade. He told me 8 shops closed their shutter because they could only do wooden blocks. After learning and mastering the craft himself at a very young age, he now sources his material from nearby villages. And he has moved into supply business now in 5-star hotels and owns 3 shops in the city, in this stretch. For him, heritage, an alien word, is buildings of these famous personalities along the road. The popular history of the grandeur of local aristocrats has made a deep impression in shaping his sense of heritage, or his experience and meaning of heritage is indeed those houses. He continues with folk theatre, kumattuli, brass utensils, before coming back to his own shop. All these are old enough to be part of Chitpur's heritage, he says. In the whole discussion, the word heritage or sense of being part of Chitpur's heritage never cropped up until I brought it up. After spending 6 months in 4 of these identified clusters along the road, instead of heritage, I heard the word work or business. Instead of being an artist or craftsman, I heard the word labor. But there were different narratives as well. Oshimda told me, indeed this is our heritage. Why am I saying that? You can't find it anywhere in the world, you know. Artists who make models, you can find them all over the world. But this technique, this deep engraving inside the wood block, that to opposite, never. It is much like a cottage industry. One has already lost printing block. This too is in the verge of being extinct. He takes pride in the exclusivity of his craft, as well as shows vulnerability and concern for his craft. I wonder, is he suggesting that heritage might be the only means through which these languishing practices can be saved? What can the category of heritage do to this dwindling craftsmanship? The road has lost its glory as the commercial epicenter of the city, as the old elite has moved to newly built east and south of Kolkata. The road only contains the memory of what it used to be. It remains as a citadel of Bengali nostalgia. Writers and journalists described it as, quote, usually associated with immutability, stasis, and timelessness. Also a state of mind, a personification of the spirit of Kolkata, always firmly present in the past. But in reality, it contains people from margin, migrant laborers and prostitutes, people from very low income category, from minority religious background, live side by side under the shadow of these decadent grand edifices. The private market still exists. Rest of the Kolkata only remembers it when they look back at their present, whenever they try to find the city's root, or whenever they think about their tradition. So it is only natural that Chitpur came back in people's memory when in the last 5 years, heritage has become a buzzword in the city. Identifying, listing, and grading architectural heritage through an expert committee is the prime focus of the institutional apparatus, which is the Kolkata Municipal Corporation. They don't have any executive power or means to do capacity building for adaptive reuse, maybe, for these private houses. Talk of heritage landscape, heritage district, or precinct, based on both tangible and intangible heritage, is not the priority of the present government. Therefore, a section of civil society have become concerned for last couple of years, and I'm going to talk about this very briefly. I don't have much time. So from 2013-14, an artist group, Hamdasti, started to work in this area. They started to collaborate with local school children, old shop owners, to reactivate the space. Their project for the very first time brought the attention back to people's existing practices in Chitpur and focused into creating a relationship with local people rather than showcasing these grand houses as part of Kolkata, exotic Kolkata tour. During ethnography, I got actively involved in the newly formed artist collaborative, now called Chitpur Craft Collective. This year, the Kolkata Festival decided to include 3 community-based art projects in their program, and Chitpur was selected as one of them. After we got some funds from the Tourism Department of West Bengal, the very first Chitpur Craft Collective Art Trail took place. For 3 days in February, we had a self-guided art trail showcasing some art installation by artists, designers who have worked directly with the local craftsmen. There were workshops, demonstrations, products on display, sale, interaction in each shop. 260 registered visitors came to Chitpur who were non-locals, but mostly Kolkata residents and few foreigners. Another artist group curated an art festival in Kumatuli for the very first time on the occasion of World Art Day. This event was sponsored by a corporate agency known as Asian Paints. So if one talks to these artist groups, it will be revealed that they don't see themselves working inside the heritage sector. They're passionate about Chitpur's past, present, and future. They want to create sustained change in the area, but one cannot deny that they're in turn creating an experience and optics for the visitors and eventually for the tourists. Despite their efforts to involve more local people and showcase local talent, they couldn't escape that fact. These initiatives are bringing new awareness of heritage in the city, but they're still far from the concept of heritage from below. Questions can be raised how the quotidian experiences and transient nature of practicing faith intermingled with work and labor can be engaged in heritage theorization. When intangibility has often been described in literature as small-scale indigenous societies' critique to global heritage, is there a need for new evocations or new language as such? Does it address some of the provocations by counter-heritage discourse, maybe? I'm still grappling with it. From the perspective of an art practitioner, it is a departure from the normative art practice and structural way of reading the city and its history. Rather than grand spectacles, they are immersed within the ethos and landscape and give the local practitioner self-esteem. Prolonged artistic involvement with them can bring can reinvigorate these dying practices. They can also offer new possibilities to experiment with their craft, both socially and economically. But how important is the category of heritage for people who are living, dwelling, migrating, making, selling on this road? When the artist collective wants to create a brand value of Chitpur, what meaning does it have for people whose everyday life is spanned out in this space? In some way, the cultural elite wants to consume the nostalgia of a romanticized past, and Chitpur's residents and workers are looking for better opportunities in life only. Rather than holding on to the past, they're waiting to let it go, because craft is subsistence for them rather than exploring their artistic abilities. So if heritagization can bring this change rather than alienating them, then it will be a welcome process. The process has just begun. That's my understanding.
Thank you very much. And now we'll invite our third and final speaker for this session, Jonathan Gardner from University College London. Is this yours, John?
Yes.
Who will be speaking to us on a forgotten archive of the spectacular London mega events and their rubble.
All right. Now, yes, from a kind of very small scale, and I love that talk just now, to something a bit larger, but also trying to drill down into some kind of getting away from these big grand heritage narratives to some extent. So, this is the Crystal Palace in 1851, just to kind of contextualize it, in Hyde Park, and I'm going to be talking about it and a different kind of archive really today, the sometimes sort of forgotten archive, I think, of the materials associated with mega events. By that I mean large-scale temporary spectacles, so like World's Fairs, Expos, Olympic Games, that kind of thing. And I'll be talking about London 2012 as well. These are some of my research sites here in London. I've chosen these two very large events, kind of bookending really London's relationship to the mega event genre, if you like, because they're incredibly well archived to some extent and over-interpreted as well. So oddly enough, you know, they are actually rarely, so there's the Olympics obviously, they're rarely actually preserved. There's few museums. There was a plan for a London 2012 museum which dedicated to the site and the games itself. That's been shelved, and I'll come back to what's happening there. But this is the sole trace of the great exhibition of the works of all nations in 1851 in Hyde Park. Just this nice signage as it is, but there's not much else in terms of the building itself. I think there's something to be said, so just to illustrate what these things are, this sort of rectangle up there is Hyde Park, and this is the second Crystal Palace in South London in Sydenham, which I'll talk a little bit about, and up the top is where the Olympic Park is in East London. You can ignore the one on the river, that's another talk for today. So I want to explore mega events materiality as a kind of counter-archival gesture to some extent, and supplement received narratives of these big spectacles that we come across. So for London 2012, often the idea of the Olympic kind of legacy as is playing out now in redevelopment of East London, and indeed the games themselves as a kind of, you know, peace among nations, Olympic truce kind of idealism. And obviously in the case of the Great Exhibition of 1851, often held up as the kind of the pinnacle of imperial British might, Victorian modernity. Some people have called it the first shopping mall, or the precursor to architectural modernism, a counter-revolutionary gesture, all kinds of labels attached to that. I want to try and dial it down a bit and go back to materials, go back to the stuff these things are built of, what they contained, and actually how their sites end up being used later on as well. So there's obviously some truth in all those kind of labels I just said, but I'm interested in this kind of smaller scale thing. So as I say, that would have been helpful. That's the two sites I'm talking about mainly, and a little bit on that. So I'm also not really talking about the contents of the displays. Here's some lovely Victorian taxidermy, Queen Victoria's favourite from the Great Exhibition, and these rather disturbing Olympic mascots. Those are, as I say, for another talk. So when I was kind of putting this together, to go back to the idea of counter archives, one of my colleagues and friends, Phil Cohen, who's a professor of sociology, had just written this kind of semi-memoir, Archive That, Comrade, which gives you a kind of idea of what it's like. It's a great read. But I like this quote: the archive is a way of bringing unlikely things together in order to take their established associations apart, and in doing so, it stakes out uncommon ground. So that's kind of something I'm trying to do today, to rethink the narratives of these grand events, really. So it strikes me, well, really with the Crystal Palace, this is what we have, this idealized vision of it, kind of all that's solid melts into air kind of thing, drifting out of the 1850s and then suddenly disappearing again, I would say, if you're familiar with the event. And it's seen as the first of these world's fairs, really. But actually, in this case, the material fragments of this building and rubble associated with it have a much longer life, and they spark new chains of associations. They challenge a singular idea of like the monument or the ruin, I would say, and this mythologization as a kind of, say, a totality representing modernity in this case, and actually remind us that there are still ruins, at least in Sydenham, of the second palace. I should say that the structure there was then moved to South London in 1854, where it lasted for about 80 years before going on fire. That tends to happen a lot to mega event structures, actually. But really, it strikes me that the material, the rubble, has potential versus the monumental, or at least the ruin, is what is at stake here. The fragments and the rubble can maybe tell us another story beyond the idea of the monument itself, or the event itself. So again, to kind of think about, well, what is rubble and what are ruins? Huff here says that rubble is material without significance, and you can read the rest of that. And this is a very common argument, that the rubble, the fragment, is of lesser value somehow for understanding the past. I'm not sure I fully agree. Maybe even in fragmentary form, these have value, these fragments of materials, building materials, of the collapse of a structure like the Crystal Palace, as I say, or indeed in the kind of ground making up the Olympic Park, as I'll show you later on. They're kind of evidential, if you like, going back to the last talk, to some extent, of the processes of life, the people who built these things, not only what was contained in them or the kind of meta-narratives they're said to represent. It's not to say fragments can't have their own associations. This is the House of Blazes in Chicago, and Rebecca Graff there talks about this. This is a pub, basically, built entirely of different random architectural fragments after the 1870 fire in Chicago. But they are transformed into something entirely new. They're decontextualized from this great big event, which everyone remembers as a kind of citywide trauma, understandably. But this is creating something really radically different, and it's not heritagized in a conventional sense. It creates a new heritage, arguably. So this is the kind of thing I'm getting at today. So that, there's a lot to be said archaeologically and in other terms about the definition of what rubble is as opposed to ruins. And this is what I'm kind of trying to get across here. Gordillo here says in his ethnographic study of ruination and rubble in Argentina that there can be a kind of inherent positivity actually in rubble, not necessarily in a kind of emotive sense, but it could be useful as a building material if nothing else, for example. And obviously, before I kind of go on to the case studies, this is really clearly linked to the idea of a kind of dialectical image in Walter Benjamin's sense. And that's obviously much used by kind of scholars of ruination and potentially of archives as well, I suppose. But the idea that I really like his insistence, the idea of the fragments of the past when reassembled expose some kind of new truth, or at least conditions for change, or to rethink what came before. So Shannon Lee Dawdy, a contemporary archaeologist, has recently written about this on profane archaeology, using Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans, and saying that in the fragments of this dialectical landscape, as she calls it, beyond the total ruination of the city, we can kind of expose micro-histories. We can say this particular building, this particular trace can be linked to a policy or a political decision or an individual life, and that in a kind of an assemblage sense can actually tell us a greater story than, say, a singular memorialization or reduction of this event to one giant ruin. So I'll turn now to my case studies. Now I've kind of tried to set out my, I suppose, conceptual underpinnings. So to 1851, this is all that is left of the site of the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park, as I say, apart from that one monument. That was held from the 1st of May 1851 to October of that year. So really only there for 6 months, but has had such a huge impact. It attracted 6 million visitors, it had 100,000 objects, you know, everything about this thing was enormous. And it's often, as I say, held up to be this kind of apogee of Victorian modernity, and of course a very kind of key site of the British Empire as it was, and has become mythologized, I would suggest, and heritagized to a certain degree too, or at least in kind of historiography. And it's still obviously having repercussions for how we conceptualize the Victorians today in political discourse, as I'm sure you're probably aware. This is the kind of thing we imagine, these grand opening ceremonies and a myriad of exhibits. And it's very well documented. To some extent, there's lots of catalogues, but the building is what I'm interested in. It's curiously absent, other than these kind of, this is actually the gardens of the building in South London. So to just, again, to avoid confusion, they moved that building to South London. So I'm kind of switching between the two, but for now, focusing on the Hyde Park site itself, the original site. And I think, well, why, you know, after this, you know, why is the building so kind of seemingly absent? The event of the Great Exhibition of 1851 seems to take over, whereas the Crystal Palace, the container, as it were, is kind of sometimes kind of merged with that, or sort of not seen to be in the same situation. And I think it's got a richer history to some extent. It lasts much longer. It has much more tangible traces. So I'm going to kind of briefly just run through, rather than going into depth of the contents of the event itself originally, but think about the famous materials, the cast iron of the palace itself. You know, what traces are left of this thing, if anything, from 1851, or even from the second palace itself, and what does that kind of tell us about the event? So very briefly, this is an original construction drawing, and this is one of the few sockets left in Sydenham in the second palace in South London. But there's something like 3,000 of these cast iron columns supporting this building, and all of them had a huge amount of kind of manpower going into making them. They're sort of wonder material at the time and mass produced. And actually, there's very few of these columns left, and they'd end up in weird places. This one's in a bog in Cambridgeshire, which has been just kind of put there to mark the draining this marsh, and it's still there. And these sort of things are just kind of almost mythical and tangible reminders of the event, but also of the building itself. So a kind of radically decontextualized archival source to some extent. But the irony is, even during the building's construction, this material is outdated. It's dangerous to build with. You build things like railway bridges and they break in storms because of the inherent qualities of cast iron. They're strong in compression, but in tension bending, they just snap. So in this kind of few remaining fragments, it tells us that perhaps the palace wasn't this kind of high-tech modern wonder to some extent, and it kind of already starts to chip away at that idea of this being the kind of monumental or a kind of romanticized ruin to some extent, I would suggest. Other materials contribute to this as well. Obviously, glass being the kind of Crystal Palace, this narrative. So many, I think it's like 300,000 glass panes of the palace, so large it contained full-size elm trees. But again, a sort of primitive technological process to create this. This was every single one of these 300,000 glass panes had to be mouth-blown and rolled out by hand. And it's kind of almost medieval to some extent. And again, it was already outdated by the time the thing opened, but showing, you know, the latest technologies inside. And it kind of, again, questions this idea of it being a direct link from kind of industrialization to today. When people say it's like, oh, it's a precursor to Le Corbusier or something like that. And actually, there's no trace of the glass really to be had. But the glass factory survives, at risk, of course, as endangered heritage in Smethwick. So it kind of speaks to different connections, these materials. And obviously, a final but perhaps forgotten material is the concrete which everything was placed on, and is actually the only trace of the palace in Hyde Park itself. And again, I like this because it's sort of, as an archaeologist, you know, they literally dug a hole got some gravel and mixed it with cement and built it on site. So there was no kind of fancy high-tech materials, all done by hand, all done by people labouring and on kind of piecework. So quite basic construction. And again, this idea of being built by hand, this huge modern structure, is quite striking to me. So going through these construction archives, even and looking at the site itself and looking at other archival materials, you start to get a different sense of what this event was about, I would say. There's been no archaeological excavation of this site, but actually it was, you can't really see it very well, but it was accidentally discovered during the Second World War. They obviously knew it was the site, but they were quarrying for sand and gravel to put into sandbags, and they uncovered these concrete lumps, the only foundations of the original Crystal Palace, still there in 1939 and 1940. And you can see this quote here, which I won't read in full, but it is quite, they got a sense of the kind of ironies of what they were doing there. Because they're basically digging down for sand to protect against bombing. Then they dump a load of bomb rubble from London itself in the Blitz into the hole, and gets commingled with these 1851's foundations. Then all of this gets scooped out by 1944 and taken to East Anglia to build airfields for more bombers to fly to Germany, to create more rubble and to create more ruin hills like Teufelsberg in Berlin, for example. So there's a kind of weird connection with rubble with the Crystal Palace there. And again, the bomb rubble was also dumped on the site of the second Crystal Palace, and that's all still there. So if you go to Crystal Palace in South London, there's 385,000 tons of bomb rubble on the top of it. So there's this kind of odd connection to ruination connected to this event. So I think, to sum up, really, thinking about the Crystal Palace and the Great Exhibition, before I move on to my final case study, as a counter-archive, rereading the materials, or at least proxies for the materials like construction records, archival photographs, many of the materials appear quite basic, quite primitive, different from how we would assume this apogee of the modern event to be. They don't kind of fit that machine-driven, technologically specialist idea, I would say, that's often attached to an event like this. They're reliant on human labor, glass blowers, that kind of thing. And then, as I say, there's a kind of loss of mystique, if you want, of the ruin when the rubble comes to the fore, or at least the fragments of its materials. And they don't exist in kind of isolated from wider society, or indeed things like conflict, even if it's a kind of weird, distant connection like this. So to move to my final discussion, the site of London 2012 in Stratford in East London, the most recent of London's mega events. It was, again, it was a very brief event. It was on for something like 2 months with the Olympics and the Paralympics in 2012. And it occupied a huge area, as you saw from that map, and it was obviously being redeveloped quite extensively now in the legacy period. But it was built, it was often kind of said to have been a wasteland before this. And it was kind of an idea of a kind of tabula rasa space, which was really incorrect, really. I think it displays something like 4,000 workers, and there's 1,000 people that lived there in various different businesses, and actually kind of craft businesses as well, interestingly enough. So that was all swept away to build these things. This is the kind of the rhetoric that goes around, and that's still, to some extent, the dominant narrative, though people are trying to change that. And as a counter-archive, I think some of the materials, including real archives, as it were, kind of make us rethink this history, the industrial past, the fact that the main stadium site is actually a landfill, and we have maps, and it's still there, that landfill, it's just capped underneath. As a kind of counter-archive, you can re-examine the processes by which a site was built, and indeed the discourses that are said to describe it. This is the barrier over the landfill right under the main stadium, and that's, as I say, all still there. And it's kind of evidential, this industrial past, the contamination that lies in the ground, the traces of the industrial history of this area, whilst very dangerous to human health, is also telling a story that this wasn't an industrial wasteland, it was still industrially active and had a very rich history, for example. But today I'm going to look at a more kind of immediate trace of this, and that's actually the fragments of these buildings and roads which were knocked down. 200 structures knocked down to build the Olympics in East London. I think there's only one standing building left. And what they did actually, amazingly, was they reused 98% of all material on the site. So 98% of those 200 buildings are actually still there in things like this. So this is crushed up factories, homes, roads, schools. Well, not really a school, but you know, various different concerns, and they're in things like bridge supports like this. And it's a useful fragment, this rubble. If you know about this as a fragment, you can tell different stories, but you do need that. They don't really speak for themselves, admittedly. This is the likes of Clay's Lane Housing Estate or a Travellers' Encampment, or it's these local businesses, Parks Galvanizing. You know, this is where they ended up, in something like this. They also made use of the archaeological past, which we excavated. I was an archaeologist there, along with my colleague Gosha, who's actually in the room as well. But it's quite interesting that, you know, I think we dug up 319 tons of these Victorian granite sets, for example. Now they've become kind of heritage features within the park. You can see us removing them there, again, from under a giant landfill site. So there's this kind of weird connection to waste, to rubble, to reuse, I would say, attached to these mega events once again. They become part of a nice aesthetic green landscape. The curbstones become stepping stones across drainage channels, and kind of feed into a kind of green narrative of the greenest ever games as well, in that reuse of materials. So I'm not claiming that these things are heritage in these reworked landscapes, but they certainly have a tendency to spark questioning of the history of the mega event itself, much like the materials of the Crystal Palaces, and just in their bulk presence, literally underpin the landscape. They've been pushed around and sealed over, but create new landforms just like this. And I think in this questioning, excuse me, throughout of these different events, we start to question their legitimacy, not necessarily saying they shouldn't happen or they should have been done in a different way, but at least to rethink the idea that they are these kind of glittering epicenter of modernity in this case, or that it was a wasteland and the Olympics kind of solved all that. And the material does rarely sort of speak for itself, but it is powerful, I would suggest. They become a kind of machine for recycling material and give us pause when we start to think about, you know, previous events and successor events. People are constantly trying to put these things on in London itself. That's the 1951 Festival of Britain, the Millennium Dome, now the O2, the Olympics itself, and now with plans to rebuild the Crystal Palace itself in South London with that familiar chap up there, Boris Johnson, which has been cancelled. But, you know, they're continually referenced in political discourse as well, to the extent that there are plans for a Brexit festival now in 2022. I think this is a fairly accurate rendering, perhaps. I don't know. But I think, not to kind of be too trite about it, but if you start to re-examine the kind of canonical vision of history, I suppose, attached to something like the Great Exhibition, we can see how politicians continue to reference these things as a cure for all society's ills, or political, or have different political aims attached to them, I would suggest. And actually think in terms of, say, the imperial legacy of Britain on display in the Crystal Palace, which I haven't really gone into today. There's, you know, it's really quite a powerful means of doing that as a counter-archive, I suspect. And I think I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. If we could have the three speakers from this session to the front. So as before, we'll have some questions for the panel, either individual questions. If they're for an individual speaker, let us know who it's for. Otherwise, collective questions for the whole panel. But maybe we'll just start with individual questions first. If anyone has a specific question for one of the speakers. Yep.
I have one regarding the Crystal Palace. When you were talking about the construction technology used in the building, you pictured as a bit of outdated technology for the time.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate how do you do that analysis? Like, how do you compare it to?
Yes. All right. It's. I think you can say the cast iron within the palace's walls, as it were. They had things like Bessemer steel on display. They had much more elaborate means of already kind of creating framed buildings. So even within about, maybe not admittedly in 1851, but at the end of the 1850s, it's kind of cast iron is on its way out as the kind of key thing as steel comes in and these new processes come in. So that's the kind of thing I was getting at. Obviously, it's not completely primitive, and that was, you know, that cast iron was made in a factory. So absolutely, it is kind of a very powerful industrial process, don't get me wrong, but I think it's not as simple as it's been portrayed, I think, sometimes in the past, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I had a specific question really for Rishika. I was trying to figure out how you used the term heritage, and I was wondering when you spoke to these craftsmen on Chipur Road, what term you say they talk about heritage. Obviously, they don't use the English word heritage. And I was wondering, what word do they use, and what do they mean by it? I mean, are they talking about it in terms of tradition, or history, or a past? Is it their past? What exactly are they talking about? And I think this is an important thing in the debates on heritage, the role of language.
Shall I? So, I use the Bengali word oitijho, and when it is oitijho, then tradition comes up. The way the skill have been passed on, then their work has a meaning for them. But whenever the word heritage comes in, they say buildings. So that is a, you know.
Do you mean the English word? Or do you mean
Yes, when the English word comes up, because so there are so many walking tours now in the area. So when people go there, mostly they look at buildings, and local people say, see, they're here to see heritage. So that is how the distinction is in their mind. So the word heritage won't come up but whenever I translate it in Bengali, then they feel like they're included, they had a past, but they may still, I mean, there should be more time for them to reckon that their work is also part of that heritage legacy of the road. Yeah.
A question for Jonathan. I'm going to be slightly provocative. Do you think that now is a gigantic difference between the way that Victorian engineering, the engineering of today, right? In fact, for the Olympic Games, we never used drawings. It was all done with BIM modelling, BIM level 2, and now moving on towards BIM level 4. I can, for the Olympic Games buildings, tell you the history of every nut and bolt, when it was, what material it was made from, who delivered it, who put it in, who tightened it up, who did the torsional tests on it, who maintained it, who will be maintaining it. And I can do that for every single component. And I can even put into that model all the management and all the tangible aspects of the heritage. In fact, the BIM model now is the primary heritage asset, perhaps more important than the building itself. And also the BIM model itself will never be an archive, because it will always be live, it will always be used. It's part of the operational phase as well as the construction phase. And I think, therefore, there is a big difference between the way that we deal with contemporary heritage and Victorian heritage.
Absolutely, yes. And I wasn't, I think that's a really interesting point, what you raise about this kind of living archive, or if it even is an archive, is that kind of that building management as it goes on. I guess what obviously I've looked at these mega events in terms of heritage in quite a few different ways. So today I focused on the materials, but not necessarily the materials you might first think when it comes to the Olympics. So I purposely didn't look at the construction materials of the stadia in terms of steel, for example. But what I was looking at there was the recycled materials from the previous buildings on site, for example, and how they are, yes, I guess they're in the model, but they are bulk. You know, I'd say one of these fragments of concrete is from somebody's house, you know, effectively. That is not accounted for by a model person, you know, and neither should it be. But I'm trying to say that there's a connection to the fragment here, rather than a kind of more technocratic, well, we have a perfect document and a record of a building as heritage. It's more about, in this case, how we conceptualize of the past through what I would call counter-archive. These fragments tell us different stories, I would say, from the construction materials of the Olympics. But I take your point, it's not a fair comparison to compare those modern materials to something like the Great Exhibition's materials in the same way, if that makes some kind of sense. Do you want to follow up, or?
Any other questions for individual speakers? If not, maybe more general questions for the panel then. Do you have one, Mirjam?
I have a question for all of you, and maybe take Wendy's argument or question as a starting point, whether we can think of objects as music. Because you all, in a way, wanted to move beyond traditional and canonical historiographies and histories that we write about certain places. And so I wondered, in all these case studies, some of them historical but also some contemporary, what does your counter-archive need in order to be durable? And should it be preserved or not? Or is that exactly what it shouldn't be? In order to be an efficient counter.
Okay, so I guess I was going to, should I answer? Should I not? This is obviously, it's sort of an issue because there's a tension always between preserving, because preservation inevitably implies a destruction. And that's something that's so inherent to the issue of preservation as it emerges in the modern world that Quatre-Meurs-de-Cassis sort of riles against it in the late 18th century. So it's already very present there. So I think that the issue is, what are the costs of preserving in the process of keeping it, being aware of those costs. So for example, I don't think it's worth it to destroy a village to end up with a bunch of ruins, if that's what one's going to end up with. That's where I'm sort of standing, because when I look at these different places, a lot of heritage has been lost by displacing these peoples, and that heritage is one of people living. So I would make a continual preference for the living. But aside from that, does that mean forgetting? It also means we have new technologies of digging that involve not digging. We have X-ray technologies. We have other technologies. We have peripheral technologies. What is the value of history as opposed to what's being created in the present? In a way, it's a sense of, do we get to imagine ourselves as immortal? Do we keep graveyards forever and ever? Or do we think of civilizations in which, as we move past our few generations of ancestors, we enter into sort of not the historical so much as the mythological? And I think it's of value to think about how many different cultures have thought about the past, not necessarily through the impulse of holding on to everything through history, but also through more sustainable impulses that allow people to traverse time with dignity, but not necessarily sort of having to carry around the weight of something that's predetermined. So that's sort of what I mean, is we have to let things also echo out. But of course, that's also depending on not having nations, not having borders, getting rid of capitalism. So, it's a pretty idealistic stance, but I also want to put that out there as a way of thinking outside of the box of always preferring the ideologies that we're inhabiting.
Well, I would just like to take up that word dignity that I heard. And when we think about some kind of heritage in some part of the world, which is lived, practiced by people, and if they don't consider that as part of their dignified life, if they want to move away from it, and if there is a whole modernist agenda of the state as well to always renounce that whatever was in the past, we should move away from that. So then how would you conceptualize heritage? I mean, then you need to let go sometime, I think.
The question is there the impulse of the state to modernize as always being the good direction. And that's also something that I think one needs to, that I question. I'm not sure that modernity has really brought us that much forward anywhere.
Hard to follow up on both those things, but agree with much of what was said there, absolutely is. I think from my point of view, from what I'm talking about, I was talking about this as a kind of accidental archive. It was never intended, I suppose, to be an archive, and I'm, you know, it's a bit of a conceit for me, I suppose, to call it an archive. I'm making it an archive by choosing to look at these slightly obscure things in the ground or bits of rubble, you know, and it is a little bit of a provocation. So I'm not suggesting the materials themselves are inherently, you know, have to be perfectly preserved, but it goes to that idea of, you know, do the objects, does the fragment sort of speak for itself, or is it simply a means of kind of provoking new conversations? Most, you know, and again, to counter that kind of wasteland discourse about brownfield sites in inner cities, for example, they aren't just real estate. These are places where people used to live, had their own heritages, had their own jobs, homes, that kind of thing. So the material, only with discussion, only with knowledge of what it actually is only so far useful there, I would suggest. But that obviously doesn't apply to all ruins or all rubble. It's quite specific to these case studies.
So maybe I can take the chair's prerogative and ask a follow-up question, which your answer was a very good segue into, because I kind of wanted to ask about the ontological status of the counter-archive and its relationship to the ways in which each of you imagine the archive, because the other thing we didn't do when we didn't define counter-archives, we didn't really confine archives except in a very, very general sense. And one of the things I was thinking about when thinking about these papers together is that you each come from a different disciplinary orientation, and each of those has its own imagination of what the conventional archive looks like. So the question is, how do you see the relationship between your own work and what what does your discipline define as the conventional archive? How do you understand the relationship between what you've just presented and that conventional disciplinary orientation towards that conventional archive? And what's at stake in your own designation of a particular counter-archive? So Johnny sort of just answered that a bit, but you might want to go into it with a kind of newly reframed question about that. So how do you imagine the archive, and how does your discipline approach that archive conventionally? And what do you see as what's at stake in your position with regards to a counter-archive? What's the point? Go.
Should I start? Okay. I'll start with a little anecdote. I come from art history, and my early work was about museums and history of archaeology. And I was invited in 2006 to work with some high school art students who were in Kars, which is in northeastern Turkey. I'd never been there before. And I took them to the site of Ani, which is an ancient Armenian city from the 13th century, and I also took them to the local museum. They were all from there. They had never been to the local museum before. Like most museums in Turkey, it's divided into a so-called archaeological section and a so-called ethnographic section that has a history. But what was interesting was the ways in which they were engaging with the ethnographic museum. Now, the thing is that these museums, they're all over Turkey. They represent the ideology of the nation state. There's the past and the present, which are brought together through the identity of the nation, and this is uniformly distributed throughout the country. One of the points of these ethnographic museums has been to create regions and to show this is how people used to be as opposed to how they are now. So we went upstairs to the ethnographic collection, and the kids said to me, saw an oil lamp and, a rug, and they were like, but we still have that. But we still have that. Why is that in the museum? And of course, the answer would normally have been, well, because you failed to modernize. But I did not want to say that to those kids. What I said was, because the people who made this museum never imagined that you would be lucky enough to still be using these things. And what I mean by telling this anecdote is that the archive, what's worthy of preservation, is often held in separation from the present tense, and it's used as a mode of control against the people who it's supposed to represent. So there's a cognitive dissonance between what's being represented in the museum by this thing called art and the people it's supposed to be representing. And so For me, the archive is something which imposes a certain system of knowledge over people through the medium of objects. And instead, I want to be able to think about how objects become meaningful through people and how that traverses time. So it's not that I'm against maintaining objects, but every time those objects become depleted of their meanings, they become empty and they can be filled with any ideology at will. And to me, that's a great danger of preservation.
I suppose to kind of think, you know, I'm both a kind of heritage person and an archaeologist, but to kind of be a straightforward archaeologist, I suppose our conception of an archive is quite different, I suppose, from it's not a purely textual archive as we might have imagined. I mean, we think of site reports, we think of, you know, specialist reports into particular kinds of materials, but the materials themselves are the archive, as are things like plans, photographs, and you could argue the sites as well are the archive, and sometimes what people remember, and because they haven't actually filled in the forms properly, so you have to actually ask them, you know, how did you dig this site all those years ago? So there's a kind of, it's already a mixing of an archive, which I quite like, and that's, I suppose, what was the second question again, sorry?
So what's at stake in your bringing a counter-archival perspective to heritage and to the conventional understanding of the archive?
I suppose I would say I'm bringing some of the archaeological sensibility to maybe more traditional archives in terms of, in a bit more of a kind of magpie-like fashion, saying, well, here is a traditional archive, here are the building plans for the Great Exhibition, as we saw, and kind of looking at them, yes, and not disputing their veracity, but connecting them to other sources, other materials, which perhaps hadn't been before, thinking not only about, oh, this is just a straightforward representation. What is planned and what is drawn is not actually what gets built. Even today, there is always going to be tiny defects. There's always going to be stories. There are things that are never quite right in a building, for example. Jim Dixon, an archaeologist, has written about this quite a lot. But I think it's not to dispute that, but it's simply to kind of problematize the idea that the archive has veracity, which many, obviously, has been well pointed out by archive scholars, and the kind of deconstruction of the archive itself, that it's a jealous kind of, jealously guards its secrets sometimes. So it is, I suppose, from my point of view, as a heritage person and an archaeologist, the challenge is to kind of unpick those fragments and link them in different ways, but combining it with the likes of kind of ethnographic sources, oral histories, putting things together differently, if that answers that.
So I come from a human geography background, and my MPhil was also in this street. I never ventured archive before I started my PhD. So in my whole association was with the space. Why did these practices emerge in this space, and how? So the how question, I think, took me to the archives this time, and I realized what an actual archive is, how historians work with archives. But my intention, I think, was always to bring out stories which were not documented in archives, which we cannot find in those colonial archives, basically. So silenced voices and voices from margins, that was my intake about counter archives, and about what that can bring into heritage discourse. That is a big question that I'm also thinking through. But I think there should be a scope for, I mean, the scope for counter archives should always be open, because, you know, the way creative processes work, that cannot be restricted by some written documents 300 years ago or 200 years ago. So that is why people's voices should come in, I think, yes.
Okay. So we have time, I think, for just one last question.
It's for Jonathan. I grew up in that area, kind of around Stratford Park, and just the image of the rubble being collected and repurposed just really kind of striking. Just thinking about the kind of communities and the people who lived there before and kind of been displaced. I'm just wondering, if through the research you were doing, you were able to capture any of those stories. I think, because I guess the same with the rubble was being kind of repurposed and removed on. So as the site, the new buildings, the houses that are unaffordable, and like where those communities and those stories have now kind of been moved on to from that land and that.
Absolutely, no, it's a really good point, and I think, as you know yourself, it wasn't a perfect area by any means. It had a lot of derelict buildings and a lot of pollution, but it did have a lot of people working there and living there. And I think, sadly, originally, so this has come from my PhD a few years ago, I sort of ran out of time and energy to get the kind of ethnographic work done that I'd done. But thankfully, a few others have, say, worked with the people on the Clays Lane estate, the housing cooperative, and the travelling community that was there, and kind of have recorded that. But most of them kind of agreed to take compensation and move away, I believe. But they were kind of dispersed to the four winds. And actually, there's a book called Dispersal, which I really recommend, which is specifically about the businesses, which was written actually by a human geographer, and two photographers, but under the auspices of Historic England. So kind of saying actually these businesses were part of the heritage of the area, and for the first time drawing on this photographic archive that these two wonderful photographers, Marion Davies and Deborah Rapp, created, and kind of saying, well, but also adding in that human geography element and saying, well, let's track down where all these businesses ended up. And a huge number of them did get compensation and move outside the M25, but they lost their customer base, so a lot of them did then fold. Some of them were still waiting for compensation like 7 years after the games. So maybe that's been resolved now, but it took years and years. So I think, unfortunately, I didn't get into that as much as I would like, but thankfully other people did, I suppose, is the answer there.
I think in the interest of keeping us, is it a quick question?
It's just, I'm a historian and particularly who works with the archive, so just I came here because I wanted to listen what is counter-archive is, like the discourses. This is just a comment in a sense that, I mean, it also depends on the archive itself is not a monolithic thing. It's also depends on the reading of the archive as well. And there has been an important intervention, whether from the feminist perspective or particularly from the Indian context, from the caste perspective. So it's, for me, the important part would be, even in the counter-archival way, like what are we reading out of that? Like somebody like me who's working on the decolonial theory, it is important for somebody like me to work with the archive. So I'm not sure what sort of a counter-archive I might be producing, but I see a say in that, like archival, and what is the my critical engagement in that sense. So I'm not sure if the human geographers have engaging with the archive in that way. That would be a kind of an intervention in engagement, the way the feminist as well as the caste historians has been doing with the archive in a sense. So,
just a quick response. I suppose one thing that springs to mind is the idea of like counter mapping, I suppose, from a kind of human geography point of view, using redocumenting places and putting different kinds of materials, be it oral histories or be it kind of archaeology, and then but actually giving that to people and saying, well, make your own maps, make that kind of thing. So I suppose in defense of human geographers, but I don't know if you want to add to that.
Oh my God. So I think the word counter-archive would be, it is what we are now grappling with as human geographers, because through this project, I didn't venture into doing historical geography. So I think if I would have done that, I could have made a balance. I mean, what I'm reading out of a formal archive and what I'm producing as a counter archive. But I was going into the field from a perspective of an ethnographer mostly, and then there I tried to engage into different creative methods. So those kind of counter archives enabled me to, I won't say read the field, because that I'm not looking at the field in a very textual way, but engage, feel, because I'm also there, and those questions of method, positionality, reflexivity, all this comes up. So I think there's a As an ethnographer and as a historian, we seek to explore different things in the field, try to bring out different nuances. So that is my response, I think.
I think with the term counter-archive, there's a danger of thinking of it as in opposition to or destructive of the archive. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that the opposite of preservation is not destruction, or the opposite of a counter-archive is not the undoing of the archive. I think it's very important to maintain archives, but maintain, not hold on to. That is, there's a distinction in which one works through archives in multiple ways and recognizes their systems of authority, systems of authorization, and so on. It's not to remove them, but also, in a sense, in a Derridian framework, to keep in mind that we're not always talking about opposites, but we're also talking about the spaces which are created between those opposites. So I think the counter-archive is sort of like the post and post-colonial. It's more of a between the opposing terms rather than the opposing term itself.
And your question provides a very apposite segue into our final paper today, which will come after a coffee break. Because I think Rachel will be talking a little bit about some of her practice, which is also archaeological, which raises lots of these questions about positionality and the ways in which this research relates to field sites and the kind of independence of coming in as an outside researcher, but also having some engagement within the context of the fields in which people study. So we've got half an hour for a break. We'll thank all of our speakers. And make sure that we're back here.